A veteran worker of the SCP Foundation sits at his terminal, performing one of the most critical tasks in the entire organization, creating a file for an as-yet undescribed SCP. But there's something terribly wrong. His eyes are glazed over, his mouth hangs open. Is this a zombie or a trained Foundation researcher? What is going on? Like any large international organization, it takes more than just the exciting, action-filled jobs to keep the wheels turning at the SCP Foundation. Sure, the head researchers, guards, mobile task force soldiers, and members of the O5 Command get all the praise, but a legion of number crunchers, cleaners, and paper pushers are equally important. One such person was archivist Walter Bainbridge, who had been tasked with digitizing some of the older records that the Foundation had on file. It was when he was innocently recording the details on SCP-050 through 060 that he first came under the strange and startling effects of SCP-055. But the most peculiar part, as with all incidents of SCP-055's anomalous effects taking hold, is that Walter had no idea any of it was happening. In his new digitized filing system, he first took note of SCP-053, Euclid class, also known as the Young Girl. This anomaly was a seemingly normal human female child who provoked homicidal insanity in those directly exposed to her. Then SCP-054, Safe class, a non-aggressive humanoid female made entirely of, as well as biologically and chemically identical to regular spring water. Next, SCP-056, Euclid class, a being that changes form to suit its environment, but only when all observers lose focus of it. And then SCP-057, Safe class, an underground chamber that crushes the humans who walk within. It was at this point that Walter received a concerned message from one of his superiors at Site-19, Mr. Kovac. The message praised the thorough digitization of the other anomalies' records, but was confused about why Walter had left out any mention of SCP-055. Immediately, Walter was embarrassed. How could he have forgotten SCP-055? That iconic anomaly known for... well, he couldn't quite say off the top of his head, but he'd be sure to look into it. A quick trip to the Site-19 archive showed him that there was actually quite a hefty file on the nature of SCP-055, which must have been the result of a huge number of studies. What struck him as strange was that all the files were filled out in pen rather than being typed up like a traditional file. The majority of these notes were written in shorthand too, as though they were frantically taken during the tests themselves on extremely short notice. There weren't even any redactions. Walter made a mental note of what he had seen, put the file back in its proper place, and headed back to his computer terminal. However, after writing in an almost trance-like state, he looked back on his work to see that he had written an entry on SCP-058, a giant evil bovine heart with insect legs and a scorpion stinger. Strange, he thought. That's when Walter got a call from Mr. Kovac on his Foundation-issue phone, and he didn't sound happy. He'd given Walter direct instructions to go back and digitize the files on 055, and instead he'd been working on 058. What was the meaning of this? Walter was typically an extremely loyal and diligent employee, but the verbal barrage from his supervisor had him considering talking back, just this once, and hoping it didn't get him demoted to D class and thrown into 682's acid bath for playtime. Walter gulped, picked up some courage, and interrupted Mr. Kovac's rant to ask if he had any idea what SCP-055 actually was. The line went silent for a moment, then his supervisor spoke again, this time with less confidence. Of course I can tell you about SCP-055. It's a classic, one of the first 100. How could you forget it's, I think it's the one with, Another long pause as Mr. Kovac seemed to search for the words, but instead just trailed off into silence. Knowing that some of the anomalies on file were dangerous mimetic hazards, Walter was worried for a moment that he may have accidentally killed his boss by getting him to think too hard about SCP-055. He asked if Mr. Kovac was okay, and finally got a reply. I'm sorry, I seem to have zoned out for a second there. What were we talking about again? But this time it was Walter who couldn't answer. He had no idea at all what the two of them were discussing just moments ago. He felt disoriented and kind of sick, like they'd taken some low-level amnestics. Mr. Kovac told Walter to get back to his filing duties and they'd speak later. Walter then checked the messages he'd received from Mr. Kovac earlier, and there it was, plain as day. You missed 055. Go back and digitize that before proceeding, Mr. K. But Walter had never even heard of an SCP-055 if such an anomaly even existed. What was going on here? In that moment, Walter realized he was dealing with something much stranger than just a standard digitization job. After all, how could he properly complete his duties if SCP-055 seemed to be impossible to speak, write, or even think about, unless he were directly observing it at that moment? Walter had to know, and ask around the entirety of Site-19 to find the answers if he had to. Sadly for Walter, he was about to embark on a much more challenging task than he could have ever imagined. To paraphrase a supposed quote from Socrates, "All I know is that I know nothing." And that's also about the extent of the knowledge we have on SCP-055, also known as the anti-meme and the self-keeping secret. What does it look like? When and how was it obtained by the Foundation? What are its anomalous abilities? Is this thing dangerous? We may never know, because the only anomalous ability of SCP-055 that we're aware of is the fact that nobody is capable of retaining any information about it. It's crucial to note that whatever 055 is, it isn't invisible or indescribable. Foundation personnel are perfectly capable of entering its containment chamber and observing it without incident, but mere minutes after leaving the chamber, any memories of the particulars of 055 seem to spontaneously erase themselves. Hence, the self-keeping secret. But this didn't deter Walter. Perhaps his greatest advantage was that he didn't know enough about the thing he was investigating to know how futile his mission was. He wanted to know the unknowable, and a pesky issue like impossibility wouldn't stop him. He'd get to whoever he needed to at Site-19 to get the answers he needed. Of course, most people had no knowledge of the mysterious anomaly. The common response he got back from his colleagues was, 055? Do we even have a 055? While the realization of sudden memory loss, or the realization of 055's existence, has been known to cause momentary stress, there are no known long-term physical or mental effects from 055's anomalous abilities. It's a fleeting idea in its purest form, like forgetting why you walked into a room. 055 could be the most harmless object on the Foundation's roster, or the most deadly. Either way, we just don't know. At times, Walter worried he was going insane. 055 and everything related to it was gaslighting him. Was 055 even real? The one thing that proved to him that 055 must have existed is that its containment chamber existed. According to the official records kept by the Foundation on the Site-19 containment facilities, 055 is kept in a 5x5 by 2.5 meter square room, constructed of 50-foot thick cement, with a Faraday cage surrounding the cement walls. The report continues that access is via a heavy containment door measuring 2 by 2.5 meters, constructed on bearings to ensure door closes and locks automatically unless held open deliberately. 055 cell is one of the few to have no posted security guards, and any personnel working on other SCPs in the area are ordered to remain at least 50 feet from the geometric center of 055 cell, where the anomaly itself is kept. When he tried to explore further why the cell was constructed in this manner, he found that, surprise, surprise, nobody knew. 055 was an anomaly whose containment requirements were so mysterious that it automatically netted itself a Keter class designation. After all, how can you properly contain something you can't even hope to comprehend? There were plenty of rumors about the true nature of 055. Some of the more conspiratorial minds at Site-19 theorized that 055 was actually an autonomous or remotely controlled spy inserted into the site to observe Foundation operations, or even humanity as a whole. If you're on the more paranoid end of the psychological spectrum, this theory makes total sense. An anomaly that's physically impossible to remember, even when writings and pictures on the subject exist, would be a perfect spy. However, this was all ultimately little more than speculation. Walter was barely any further along than when he started. There were multiple points in his investigations where Walter seriously considered giving up, until finally, he had a major breakthrough. Dr. Bartholomew Hughes and Dr. John Marichek were two scientists that had performed extensive research into 055, and who, Walter hoped, might have the answers he sought about the self-keeping secret. These scientists were the first to discover the anti-memetic nature of 055, performing numerous tests on D-Class personnel to see if it was possible to create feasible written records, sketches, or any other records or impressions that could bypass its anomalous effects. The disorienting, memory-ruining effects of 055 also extend to any materials concerning 055. It seems to be a truly uncrackable code, but Dr. Hughes may have finally found some cracks in the armor. For starters, the fact that we're able to remember that 055 is an anti-memetic is an ironic exception to its anti-memetic qualities. This revelation also inspired another realization from Dr. Hughes. Would it be possible to discover more about 055 from the process of deduction rather than the typical induction? In other words, could they possibly learn about 055 by figuring out all the things it isn't, rather than what it is? Dr. Marichek designed an experiment with Dr. Hughes to explore this theory. They designed the experiment around a simple question: is 055 not spherical? In designing the question to specifically find out what 055 isn't, they hoped to subvert the anomaly's anti-memetic powers. Walter was fascinated by this potential method of getting answers. Marichek and Hughes found that, while the questioning process for those exposed was often arduous and frustrating, they could now definitely say that 055 is not a sphere. It is theoretically possible to discover the true nature of 055 by an almost endless barrage of deductive questions, though whether Command would authorize the resources for such extensive testing is still an open question. Walter, in his desperation, begged Marichek and Hughes for clearance to view 055 himself. The curiosity had become too great during his search to just walk away with the single fact that 055 wasn't spherical. He needed to see this thing. And after several weeks of filling out forms and cutting red tape, his wish was finally granted. Walter Bainbridge was allowed a private audience with SCP-055, the subject of his months-long obsession. Outsiders observed that Walter spent just over an hour in the containment chamber, taking photos, drawing sketches, writing down notes, recording audio logs, and reciting memory mnemonics. He was pulling out every stop to counteract the anti-memetic effects of the self-keeping secret. He was adamant that he would not be defeated by his non-spherical nemesis, not after all this time and effort. Once his time in the 055 containment chamber was over, he retired back to his office to finally digitize his exhaustive findings, so that his supervisor, Mr. Kovac, would finally get off his back. Walter smiled, took a deep breath, and began to type. SCP-059, Keter Class. This anomaly is a radioactive mineral that emits a unique radiation known as delta radiation. Exposure to this radiation has caused strange fungal growths on the infected... Wait, what was this supposed to be about again? Oh well, it couldn't have been that important. You've finally done it. After years of adding movies and shows to your queues, you've officially run out of things to watch on Netflix. You've also exhausted your entire backlog of books, and you've even run out of cereal boxes to read. So you're left roaming the streets in search of entertainment. That's when you see a worn-looking flyer stapled to a nearby telephone pole. It's an ad for a local community theater production of a play you've never heard of. A play called The Hanged King's Tragedy. Normally, you wouldn't think of yourself as much of a theater person, but something about the art on the poster grabs you. There's a strange figure on the poster, its face shrouded, its body wrapped in a web of chains. Your curiosity gets the better of you, and you check the performance date. To your pleasant surprise, opening night is a week from now, and you don't have anything planned. You've made up your mind. You're going to attend a live performance of The Hanged King's Tragedy. It's going to be the first live play you've ever seen, and little do you know, it may also be the last. Because The Hanged King's Tragedy isn't just any old play. It's a powerful and deadly memetic hazard that may be one of the gateways to an even more dangerous being. It's known to the SCP Foundation as SCP-701, so take your seats, be sure to read your programs thoroughly, and prepare for the dark and terrifying tale of the Hanged King's tragedy and the wave of death and destruction it causes in its theatrical wake. But how could you know any of this? While you head home to make dinner, looking forward to seeing the new play next week, the local thespians are hard at work performing dress rehearsals. The director, one Marcus Fitch, happened upon a copy of the play while looking for Carolinian theater that's a little more family-friendly than some of the Shakespearean classics. When he'd first discovered the Hanged King's tragedy on a theatrical forum, it was described as being similar to Shakespeare's Hamlet and Titus Andronicus, but the violence was largely off-stage and implied, with a lot of the play's nastier elements glossed over, perfect for audience of all ages. Given the fact that performances of the Hanged King's tragedy tend to be mass casualty events, for reasons you'll soon see, the Foundation does everything they can to control the spread of the play's script. All copies are kept in a triple-locked vault in a secure Foundation archive, which currently includes 2 copies of the original publication that are dated to the year 1640, 27 copies of the 1965 trade paperback edition, 10 copies of a 1971 hardcover printing, 21 floppy diskettes containing the play's script, and 1 SVHS videocassette tape containing a live taping of one particularly infamous incident. However, this seemingly does little to prevent new performances of the Hanged King's tragedy from occurring. The text of the play continually pops up online, often under different or misspelled titles, preventing Foundation web crawlers from keeping track of them all. Nevertheless, the Foundation does everything in its power to detect and stop performances before they can go ahead. The danger of putting on or even viewing a performance of the Hanged King's tragedy cannot be overstated. It's believed that, in the almost 300 years since its original publication, it's claimed 10,000 lives through performances at the very least. And if you're in attendance, dying quickly is one of the better outcomes. The origins of this memetic virus are just as mysterious as the power that seems to drive its effects. The play never had a declared author, and the publisher, one William Cook, disappeared from all historical records after the play's publications. Performances have been varied over the 300 years the play has been active. It's been spotted everywhere from British university drama troupes to American high school plays. In what could have been an even more disastrous tragedy, a television adaptation of the play was almost broadcast by the BBC before the Foundation stepped in and put a stop to it. While its containment classification is currently Euclid, scientists who have studied the play have campaigned strongly to upgrade the Hanged King's tragedy to Keter class, on account of its unpredictability and tendency to manifest across the globe, with incidences appearing decades apart. While members of the O5 Council are skeptical, some researchers even believe that given a wide enough exposure, the Hanged King's tragedy could cause a dreaded XK class end-of-the-world scenario. It is that dangerous. At this point, you're probably wondering, what exactly is the Hanged King's tragedy? What's the play even about? As the name suggests, the play is a tragedy and takes place over 5 acts during the Carolinian era, portraying the drama of the royal court much like a number of plays from that time did. It takes place in the city of Serco, the capital of the mysterious fictional kingdom of Trinculo. The focal point of the play is the conflict between Gonzalo, the illegitimate king of Trinculo, and Antonio, the true heir to the throne. Before the start of the play, the previous king of Trinculo, King Sforza, had been betrayed and murdered by Gonzalo. Gonzalo led Sforza into the woods, where he and his men subdued the king and hanged him from a nearby tree like a common criminal. Hence the Hanged King's tragedy. However, Gonzalo is trying to keep his part in the king's murder a secret to keep the throne for himself. But his guilt-stricken wife Isabella threatens to spill the secret of Sforza's murder. While Antonio tries to uncover the truth of what happened in the woods, Gonzalo, in true Shakespearean villain style, plots further murders of his co-conspirators and loose ends to keep his dark secrets safe. This is where the play gets a little gruesome. One enemy, Gonzalo had killed and cooked into a stew. He then intends to use this stew to murder his entire court with the help of an effective and undetectable poison he was given by the mysterious ambassador of Alagada. Though you'll be pleased to know that this tragedy has somewhat of a happy ending. In the end, Gonzalo is exposed and Antonio claims his rightful place as king of Trinculo. Unlike his predecessor, Antonio decides to show mercy, and Gonzalo is exiled to a monastery for life rather than being executed for his murderous ways. The heroes are rewarded, the villains are punished, and all the deserving parties live happily ever after. At face value, nothing seems off about the play. If you're familiar with other works of the era, you might even find yourself getting bored while reading it. How can something this normal be the cursed play that claims so many thousands of lives? But this play's unassuming nature only serves to make it more dangerous. It doesn't appear that the mimetic hazard is caused by simply reading the play. Like all good theater, it only truly comes to life on stage. And your local production of the Hanged King's tragedy is no exception. As your community's amateur actors study and rehearse the play, making sure to commit every scene, every line, every single word to memory, they don't notice the little things that, to an outsider, might seem a little off. Occasionally during group dress rehearsals, actors will veer from the script. And we're not talking about flubbed lines or simple improvisation. No. Actors will at times seem like they're reading from a completely different script, and their fellow performers will respond in kind. The play lulls you into a false sense of security. Stagehands, crew members, even the director all believe they're performing the play exactly as it was originally written. Okay, so that's not so bad. A play that changes itself. But things are going to get worse from this point. Much, much worse. But hey, why let a deadly anomaly ruin your evening plans? You've been looking forward to seeing this play all week, and you couldn't seem to get that figure from the poster out of your mind. You have no idea that this entity is wanted by the SCP Foundation, and that its designation is SCP-701-1. All you want is an unforgettable theater experience, and you will certainly get one. It's a packed house. Not an empty seat in sight. The house lights dim and the curtain opens. Act 1 is quite normal, with all the backstabbing and royal court intrigue you'd expect. You actually feel yourself getting a little bored. A big yawn escapes your mouth. You're thinking that maybe this was a big mistake, and you might sneak out between acts, when just then, you see it. In the final scene of Act 1, you see the shrouded figure lingering in the background against the curtains. He seems so still, he's almost like a shadow. But as each act seems to run into the next, he becomes more prominent. The rest of the cast never acknowledges him as they deliver dramatic monologues, but he's always there. Finally, the play reached Act 5, the grand banquet scene where it all comes to head. Gonzalo is preparing to poison his dinner guest with his cannibal stew, while Antonio and his allies plot to reveal his terrible crimes and dethrone him. You find yourself so gripped by the drama of it all, you almost didn't notice that the shrouded figure of SCP-701-1 was standing right among the actors now. While unbeknownst to you, the actors have been deviating from the scripted story this whole time, things are about to really take a turn for the horrific. SCP-701-1, who is now known to the other performers as the Hanged King, produces a blade from thin air and passes it to the actor playing Gonzalo's wife. The actors on stage suddenly become entranced. They attack and restrain Gonzalo, and a noose drops down from somewhere above the stage. The actors proceed to ritualistically hang Gonzalo before the actor playing his wife stabs him to death, all while chanting, "Blood for the Hanged King." You should be horrified, but you're not. You don't even feel like yourself anymore, and you're loving everything that's happening. On stage, a series of other nooses fall from above. Each actor grabs their own noose and the cast repeats "Blood for the Hanged King" before sacrificing their lives to the shroud-wearing monster. If the carnage stopped there, it would be bad enough. But this play doesn't just drive its players to acts of violent insanity, it pulls in the audience too. Before you know it, You're pulled into a vicious brawl with your fellow theatergoers. There's biting, clawing, punching, people hitting each other with chairs like it's a wrestling cage match. It's such a frenzy of random senseless violence that the building can't contain it anymore. You and anyone else who isn't dead already spilled out onto the streets and start attacking everyone you can get your hands on. It's transformed from a pleasant night out at the theater into a full-blown riot. Even the police, sent in to control the situation, are overwhelmed. It isn't until the SCP Foundation sends a number of mobile task forces trained in advanced crowd control that the situation finally begins to de-escalate. But you don't care. Even when large men in Foundation tactical gear are holding your arms, you still try to bite and kick. The effects of the play normally wear off after around 24 hours, but until then the infected, including you, are just rage-fueled monsters. In the end, it takes 4 adult men to properly restrain you. You'll feel the bruises from their nightsticks tomorrow, but now all you feel is hate and violence, and a single-minded devotion to something out there that you couldn't possibly comprehend. And the whole time you're screaming one thing over and over again: blood for the hanged king. Norse mythology tells the story of Jörmungandr, a great serpent so long that it wraps itself the entire way around Midgard and bites its own tail. Legend says that when Jörmungandr unclasps its jaws and starts to unfurl, it will signal the beginning of Ragnarok, the destruction of the world. And that was about as much information as the Foundation gave to Agent Nielsen when they assigned him to his watch duty in Greenland. In the frozen tundra all day, every day, he had been equipped with a sniper rifle, thermal goggles, and put up high in a watchtower. If he saw anyone, he had to shoot on sight, no questions asked. Whether it was his squad mates, the Brigadier General, or even his own mother, if anyone walked across the barren stretch of ice ahead of him, he was to shoot them dead. Under no circumstances was anyone allowed to enter that cave. The fate of the world could depend on it, but it was cold, and the days were long. For months he'd been sitting there by himself without seeing a single soul walk across the glacier. That's why it took him so long to spy the figure stumbling across the ice half a kilometer away. But the person didn't look any clearer when Agent Nielsen took a look through his thermal binoculars. Barely registering as much warmer than the snow around him, the man stumbled forward, seemingly unaware of the world around him. Could this be the start of the swan song of the world? Is this what he had been warned about? Without a moment's hesitation, Agent Nielsen snatched up the sniper rifle and readied his sights on the man. Somewhere buried deep beneath the Greenland ice is one of the most dangerous SCPs that the Foundation has ever come across. To say that SCP-722's reawakening could spell the destruction of human civilization is no idle concern. Classified as a Keter-level SCP, SCP-722 has been nicknamed Jörmungandr after the Norse myth. Researchers speculate that the creature's existence could in some way be linked to the early origins of the story of the Norse creature. 722 was brought to the Foundation's attention relatively recently. Environmental activist group Greenpeace was shooting a documentary on the effects of global warming on glaciers in Greenland. A small crew, including a director, producer, 3 camera operators, and a sound recordist, headed out to get some close-up footage from amongst the glaciers. Walking from ice sheet to ice sheet, they noticed several rounded entrances to what looked like deep ice caves. Surmising that these openings were only accessible to them because of the melting glacier ice, the crew climbed down into the caves to get some never-before-seen footage. Some of the footage of their exploration has been recovered since, and in the background of several shots as they are adjusting exposure and pulling focus, you can hear the producer and director theorizing about where these caves have come from. They initially seem to think that the caves are millennia old, preserved by sub-zero temperatures, but soon they come across several markings on the walls, ancient hieroglyphs and symbols. None of the crew were language experts, and so in the footage you can hear them struggling to identify which people group would have carved those into the ice walls. In the decades since, language experts from around the world have studied these markings on those walls, and have still been unable to identify any discernible links to any known human script. Most agree that it does seem to predate the settlement of the island by Eric the Red at the start of the 11th century. During this period, it is believed that there were no human settlements on the island, so the origins of this script remain unknown. As the footage goes on, you may start to notice something that the Greenpeace crew does not. One of the ice walls is no longer a wall at all. It looks like a rock in some of the footage, but whenever a flashlight shines on its surface, you can see a pattern to it. Scales. Then an opening at the far side of the tunnel. The crew emerges into an enormous cavern, estimated to be upwards of 200 meters in height and several times wider. Even their powerful flashlights struggle to cut through the darkness inside. That's the point that the sound recordist notices the scales running alongside them. As the camera pans, you see that they have been walking alongside a tail, several times taller than them. A tail that snakes its way through the darkness of the cavern to meet a hulking mass at the other side, shrouded in darkness. That is where the footage cuts off. Those Greenpeace filmmakers were next seen in a local town that evening. None of them had the chance to extol the wonders of what they'd encountered that day, as they were all sick. A couple went straight to bed in their lodgings complaining of intense headaches and exhaustion. Others tried to check themselves into the ER, but never made it. Each of the crew died of different causes: necrosis of the skin, internal bleeding, kidney failure. By 9 p.m. that day, all of them were dead. Fortunately, there just so happened to be a low-level Foundation agent staying in the same guest house as them who heard the commotion. Within 2 days, a perimeter was established. Within 2 years, the Foundation gained the bulk of knowledge of this SCP that they rely on to this day. It is unknown exactly how large SCP-722 actually is. A hulking serpent, half buried in ice, much of its body cannot be observed. It sleeps coiled up in the middle of the cavern that the filmmakers happened across. Some of its body is buried beneath fallen-in parts of the caves, others frozen into the ground around it. However, based on what can be observed of this SCP, it is estimated to be in the ranges of 8 to 12 kilometers from head to tail. Fortunately for just about everyone, including you, this SCP appears to be dormant. At no time since its discovery has this SCP been observed to move, make a sound, or otherwise indicate consciousness. Sensors are installed in the chamber to monitor its life functions and study its heart rate, temperature, brain activity, and more. One concern to the Foundation is that since its discovery, 722 has had a 0.9% uptick in neural activity. Researchers hope that this is just a natural part of the sleep cycle and that it will return to a deeper slumber soon. That is the hope, at least. So what makes this SCP so dangerous then if it's sound asleep? Well, let's go back to Agent Nielsen staring through the scope of his rifle. The barrel kicked back, a puff of warm smoke there and gone in cold air. He watched just long enough to confirm the kill before radioing back to command what he had observed. Within an hour, the cleanup crew arrived. Riding on snowmobiles, they waited at a distance for an hour before approaching the body. Rather unceremoniously, they wrapped it up in a black plastic bag, strapped it to the back of their snowmobile, and took it away for cremation. Nielsen just sat there in his watchtower the whole time, observing it all. The person looked sick, and not the kind of sick that you'd get from spending too much time out there on the ice. Their skin had gone rotten, like they had gangrene or leprosy. It wasn't just your usual frostbite. Most concerning, they'd been wearing a jumpsuit, standard issue for D-Class personnel. Only a vial held in their cold, dead fingers was any kind of clue for Nielsen as to what had been going on in that cave. But that was as close as the agent ever came to understanding the mysteries of SCP-722. The vial, however, was in many ways all he needed to know. That is because contained in that vial was a sample of the liquid secreted by 722. It is a liquid that the Greenpeace crew came into close contact with when they found the creature, and it's a liquid that promises and denies great power and great risk to the Foundation. Any and all attempts to study this liquid in any meaningful sense have failed. Anyone who comes into contact with it will immediately suffer acute sickness. Interestingly, however, there seems to be little consistency as to how this sickness manifests itself. Some develop a number of cancerous cells, whilst others lose cognitive function due to brain swelling. Symptoms seem to vary from person to person. Naturally, this makes studying the substance very difficult. Hazardous material suits have been deployed for researchers attempting to study it, but have all failed, despite being otherwise effective against chemical, biological, and radioactive threats. How the substance is able to infect them is unknown. Sadly, a good number of scientists had to die to make this discovery. Another route of study is to take the substance out of the cave and observe it under laboratory conditions. This was what Agent Nielsen observed as he shot and killed the D-Class personnel emerging from the cave. The D-Class had been sent in to retrieve the vial of the substance for external study. While a safe and direct route of entry and exit had been planned for the man to take, he became critically ill whilst in contact with 722 and developed an aggressive fever. No longer coherent over the radio, he dropped out of signal, wandering through the tunnels for 2 hours until emerging out of an exit high up on the glacier. 2 agents with higher security clearance were dispatched to deal with the body. The reason for their wait was for their own safety. 722's toxin appears to denature with time away from its source, causing it to weaken in potency. If they had approached immediately, they may have well suffered similar fates to the D-Class. They survived, but the sample was ruined. All subsequent attempts have also been met with failure. It seems almost impossible to capture a clean sample and transport it any kind of distance. With this toxin, the Foundation would have possession of an immense biological weapon, akin to the discovery of the atom bomb. But as of right now, all it's good for is killing D-Class personnel. Initially, the Foundation believed the fluid to be a defense mechanism for the SCP, something to protect it in its deep sleep. But the more time is spent observing it, the more time this perception is shifting. SCP-722's toxin appears instead to be a weapon. As such, the containment of this creature is of paramount importance. There are 8 known access points into the tunnel network that would grant access to SCP-722. Each of them has been sealed with reinforced gates with additional layers of soundproofing. At regular 4-hour intervals, nitrogen gas cooled to a near-liquid state is to be pumped through these doors without fail. It is believed that the creature is a form of proto-reptile, and so is theoretically cold-blooded. Its internal temperature is dictated by its surroundings. Therefore, by keeping a cool average temperature in these caves, it is thought that this SCP's slumber can be prolonged. How long is unclear. With rising global temperatures year after year, the threat that the Greenpeace activists were proclaiming is very real, just perhaps not quite in the way they'd envisioned. Not only would there be an increase in natural disasters and a decrease in biodiversity, there would also be a 12-kilometer snake roaming around the planet, killing anyone in its path. Not ideal. As such, the Foundation has also planted a number of highly skilled individuals in prominent environmental positions in the hopes of turning the tide of global warming sooner. Should the ice in that cave system warm by even a couple of degrees, who knows what kind of spike they might see on the neural monitors. This SCP naturally is buried deep beneath layers and layers of security clearances too. Only in exceptional circumstances and for vital maintenance is anyone allowed to approach this SCP. A minimum of 2 Level 3 clearance agents are required to sign off on any such works. In recent years, a new Brigadier General took charge of the containment operations of SCP-722 after his predecessor was stripped of his duties. Overly zealous experiments and increasingly desperate attempts to harvest or synthesize the 722 toxin saw an alarming uptick in neural activity. Over 40 D-Class personnel were processed and disposed of within a 2-week period in an attempt to assemble a micro-laboratory within the main chamber itself. This project failed, and the noises of construction threatened the peace that had so long been maintained beneath the glacier. The new Brigadier General is taking no such risks, enforcing a zero-tolerance policy on anyone approaching Site 103 unless suitably cleared. A number of hikers have sadly had to be killed this way, but the Foundation believes it to be a necessary sacrifice to keep the peace. It is quite easy to find a convincing backstory for their untimely deaths and the lack of bodies to bury. Just another person to get lost and fall down a crack in the glacier, warning stories that are shared and planted in local towns and on the internet. The only threat to this current peace is a new avenue of inquiry that researchers have stumbled across, a link to a group of animals found halfway around the world. Monitor lizards of the genus Varanus seem to share a similar set of traits to SCP-722. namely the nature of their toxins. You may be familiar with the bite of a Komodo dragon. While the initial wound sure does hurt, the real damage comes in the following hours and days as necrosis sets in from the toxins in its mouth. Could these creatures share a common ancestor? Could 722 be the common ancestor? As of right now, it is just a hunch, but it's one that has taken root amongst the research staff. In order to find out more, though, they need samples, tissue samples, taken straight from the SCP itself. The only way to do back is to go back into the caves and start cutting. If a bit of construction noise was enough to raise brain activity by 0.9%, taking a hunk of flesh could prove a whole lot more dangerous, not least for the personnel involved, who will all have to sacrifice their lives. The potential benefits could be huge. A way to study fatal diseases in a new light, perhaps finding a way to reverse engineer cures to some of the deadliest conditions on the planet, or perhaps the missing ingredient to synthesizing the most powerful biological weapon in human history. Maybe worst of all, it could all trigger the reawakening. Do you remember how the story of Jörmungandr ends? With a prediction that when the great serpent uncoils, the end of the world, Ragnarok itself, will arrive. But that's just an old fairy tale, right? True horror, the airplane door, belching smoke, and a burning red light. The dead talking in ancient guttural Latin. A monstrous angel made of rings, wings, and eyes whipping barbed tentacles at screaming, terrified priests. You can scarcely imagine a more hellish place. Bishop Franklin's knees gave out under him as soon as the man set foot back on solid ground. Nearing his 70th birthday, he'd never been a particularly tough man, but after the day he'd had, he doubted he'd ever be the same again. Almost being ripped into another dimension, almost being at the center of a nuclear explosion, seeing. He threw up on the ground as the Foundation personnel rushed over to him. Never, never again. Just 8 hours earlier, Bishop Franklin had been getting on with his Friday preparations. They had Mass coming up this weekend, so he was doing the rounds of the cathedral, putting out new candles and straightening pews. He was nearly done, ready to get on with the rest of his morning, when he saw 2 suited figures entering the cathedral. He shuffled over to them, trying to explain that they were closed, but quickly faltered when he saw the grave look on their faces. Just 10 minutes later, he was in the back of their car, still holding a spare candle, with agents from the SCP Foundation sitting on either side of him. They handed him file after file, each most redacted, explaining the basis of who they were and where they were headed. It was a lot for the old priest to wrap his head around. He'd always believed in a higher power and a spiritual realm, but this sounded a whole lot more serious than that. Monsters, aliens, other dimensions, facilities, portals. He questioned the agents on it. They just looked grimly from one to another as the car wound its way to the private airstrip in the middle of nowhere. Bishop Franklin had always hated flying, but he hated it a whole lot more as he approached the airplane with no idea where he'd be landing. A small group of men were gathered on the runway just by the foot of a Boeing aircraft. It seemed like a pretty substantial plane for such a small group of them. He was at least a little heartened to see that none of them had brought luggage either. In fact, most of them were just like him. As Bishop Franklin approached the group, he recognized various faces, other bishops, archbishops, and senior priests. With him there, they totaled 7. The others all looked at him, not saying much. Bishop Franklin tried his best to start asking questions, but 2 things happened in quick succession that closed his mouth very quickly. Firstly, the luggage hold of the plane was opened, and 2 enormous shapes were loaded into it via forklift. Each shape had unmistakable symbols on the sheets covering them. Nuclear danger. Reeling from this revelation, Bishop Franklin turned to the group to be face to face with the Pope himself. He immediately shut his mouth. You may also be wondering what on earth was going on at this airfield. The truth is, Bishop Franklin, along with 6 other priests of Abrahamic faiths, were about to embark on the monthly flight of SCP-616. Within this plane, as all of these men were soon about to find out, exists an emergency door. Covered with satanic iconography, this door, when opened at ground level, operates just like any other emergency door, leading to the outside of the plane. although any individuals who had passed through this door in this normal state reported feeling heightened anxiety during and after. However, once a month, this door will be anything but normal, opening a gate to, well, you'll soon see. In order to mitigate the threat posed to humanity through SCP-616-1, or the Gate, the plane must be in the air at the time of its opening, far above and away from any human settlements. In order to keep this event contained, the door must be kept open for the duration of the portal's existence until it has closed of its own accord. But holding this door open is not a simple test of strength, it is a test of belief. In order to protect all of humanity from unknown horrors of a cataclysmic scale, 7 priests of Abrahamic faiths must be on board for this monthly flight, praying for the door to remain open. The ability to keep the door open, it turns out, is unrelated to physical prowess, but instead is based entirely on one's own belief that the door can be held open. As such, religious figures praying to a higher power are incredibly well suited to the task. Once per year, the flight is blessed by the Pope, and every time the plane takes off, it must be holding 2 nuclear warheads in its hull. Both can be remotely detonated by the ground team, who will be in constant radio communication with the pilot. Should the pilot fail to give them regular updates on the status of SCP-616-1, the event will be treated as an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, and both nuclear devices will be detonated without hesitation. But Bishop Franklin only knew about half of this information from his redacted set of documents and had forgotten half of them on his stressful car journey. As he strapped himself into a window seat, he was trembling like a leaf. He desperately wanted to complain about being put into this situation, but he wasn't entirely sure who he would complain to. If he spoke to anyone external about what he was about to witness, he had been told by the Foundation agents that he would be administered with a Class C amnestic, whatever that meant. He really didn't want to find out. Fortunately for him, the most familiar of the faces from the group of priests sat next to him in the aisle seat. Bishop... what was his name? Sensing Bishop Franklin's uncertainty, the man reached to hand over and warmly reintroduced himself. Bishop Pete. They'd met 2 years ago in Berlin. Just that small action was almost enough to settle Bishop Franklin's nerves as the plane started to barrel down the runway. Almost. The plane took off, causing the old man's stomach to drop. Heart hammering, he looked around, spotting the emergency door. It was just up ahead of him, around the middle of the fuselage. It would have looked like a normal emergency exit, but for the blood-red markings scrawled across it. A wave of dread washed over him. It certainly looked evil, that was for sure. Trying his best to help, Bishop Pete struck up a conversation. He explained it wasn't his first time doing this. He'd been drafted to help 3 months ago. It was scary for sure, but everything was totally fine. The Foundation had planned everything to a T. It would have helped Bishop Franklin's nerves, but it only made his mind jump to the nuclear weapons he'd seen loaded into where his suitcase would have normally gone. The two of them lapsed into silence for a while. No one on the plane was really speaking. He supposed he should have used this opportunity to pray, but according to his briefing, he'd be doing a lot of that very soon. He hadn't entirely understood what the Foundation had meant by that. He'd been told to pray to, quote, keep the door open. What had they meant by that? A bang shattered the silence as the emergency door slammed wide open. In an instant, the plane went into a nosedive as all the air rushed from inside. The lights went out for several seconds, then came back on in flashing, panicked spasms. Bishop Franklin clung for dear life onto the back of the chair in front of him as the roar of air rushed around him. It had gone dark outside, with shapeless clouds swirling around him, shaking the plane. Screaming voices filled the aircraft. Not just the voices of the men on board, but women and children too, crying out in agony and terror through throats that sounded like they'd been lashed with razor wire. Then he saw it. SCP-616-1. The gate was wide open. Smoke billowed out of it, crawling along the floors of the cabin like an octopus creeping its way along the ocean floor. Red light seemed to spill out of it, but when he tried to look through the gate itself, it was like his brain wasn't working anymore. There were colors there, but there were ones he didn't recognize. Maybe they weren't colors at all. It was like his brain fixated on trying to sort them into something that made sense, something rational. A hand grasped his arm and he turned to see Bishop Pete staring at him with wild eyes. The plane was going down, they could both feel it, and that emergency door was slowly creeping shut. They had been brought onto this plane for one job only, to pray, like their lives depended on it. Bishop Franklin screwed his eyes shut and clasped his hands together. He hadn't prayed like that since he was a little kid, but he figured now was the time to use all the tricks in the book. He begged and pleaded in a tiny voice for God to keep that door open. It felt so counterintuitive, so backwards, to want to keep that kind of door open as the air roared and screamed around him. But a small voice inside of him told him to persevere, have a little faith. But suddenly, the bishop noticed that the man sitting alongside him had fallen silent. Feeling like a naughty child at mass, he opened one eye and peered sideways. Bishop Pete was still in his seat, but he'd slumped over. He wasn't breathing. His skin was cold to the touch, deathly cold. Then all of a sudden, his head rocketed backwards and he started talking. Not talking like a normal man, but talking like a man possessed. His dead eyes rolled around in his head aimlessly as guttural voices rasped out of his throat. None of them were the words that Bishop Franklin recognized. They sounded almost like Latin, but far darker and more ancient. And the more the dead man spoke, the more the emergency door closed. The bishop started praying again, much harder this time, digging his fingernails into his palms so hard that he felt them drawing blood. He needed to keep this door open. He had to, and he could. He believed it entirely in that moment. The door banged back open, wider than ever despite the chanting of the dead body in the seat next to him. Nightmares swelled to the forefront of his mind as the plane hurtled to the ground. Only the plane wasn't hurtling to the ground. In fact, it was flying at a perfectly steady altitude of 10,972 meters, with an airspeed of about 780 kilometers an hour. In fact, aside from the death of Bishop Pete, everything within the plane was going perfectly to plan. Deaths of priests were just an occupational hazard of keeping this SCP contained. The pilot at the front of the plane regarded the whole situation playing out behind him while feeding constant information back to base. Everything was going perfectly according to plan, until the angel appeared. Bishop Franklin wasn't the first one to see it. That was the unfortunate lot of Archbishop Michael, who was sitting closest to the emergency door. He first spied it while staring through into the void, but his screams of terror, warning those around him, were drowned out by all the other commotion. It was only when the angel's wings crept their way through the edges of the door and the creature let itself into the cabin that the others saw it. But by this point, it was too late for Archbishop Michael. The angel was not like the angels we see in pop culture, a tall blonde person with white robes, fluffy wings, and a gentle face. It was a shifting mess of eyes and tortured wings, partially crawling along the ground, partially floating under the weight of its massive frame. It had to squeeze itself through the door to fit into the plane, but as it did, it lashed out at the Archbishop with a sinewy tendril and got to work, violently killing him. That was when Bishop Franklin saw it and began to panic. He wanted nothing more than to stop praying, to let the emergency door slam shut and keep this creature away from them. But that little voice inside his head told him that wouldn't work. If that door was allowed to close before the gate had, then it would cause the apocalypse. He could not have that blood on his hands. So he prayed, sweat pouring down his face as the angel forced its way through the gate and into the cabin. He prayed as it slumped across the aisles, working its way along the line of men, slaughtering them one by one. He prayed as it saw him and rose to its full height, unfurling great wings and readying itself for the kill. And he prayed as a wind more powerful than any on earth blew through the cabin and pulled the angel back through the gate. The emergency door slammed shut, and in an instant, the plane seemed to right itself. No more turbulence, no more wind. The light flickered once more and then came back on steadily. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling about 4 hours too late. Bishop Franklin couldn't believe the time when he looked at his wristwatch. He had been on this plane for weeks, surely, not just 4 hours. That was absurd. It all felt like a dream as the aircraft circled around the airstrip, preparing for landing. Everything in the plane seemed totally normal to him now, except of course for the 4 dead bodies, one of which was slumped towards him in the aisle seat. The The plane landed. The bishop staggered down the stairs and threw up on the blacktop. After a few awkward moments, the pilot sidled over to him and muttered a quick thanks. "I was really close to calling it a failure there and having to set off them nukes. I don't know what you prayed for, but you did good today." Bishop Franklin didn't feel like he did good. He felt like he'd had his whole life, his whole worldview, turned upside down in the space of an interstate flight. He had been moments away from either being vaporized by a nuclear bomb or from having economy seats to the premiere of the destruction of the world as we knew it. But just 31 days later, Bishop Franklin was on that same flight again, praying his hardest as the aircraft dropped into freefall. If there was one thing that the Foundation noticed about working with religious leaders, it was that they had a real determination to keep coming back to help keep the world safe. What the Foundation didn't have the heart to tell them was that all of the satanic markings on the door were actually fake. They had been added by researchers in an attempt to make SCP-616-1 carry more significance for those in the aircraft. Later testing revealed that it was not exclusive to Abrahamic faiths, or any faith groups for that matter, that they could keep the gate open. Anyone who believed they could do it was capable of it. Faith leaders, however, are still being utilized, and the blessing is still being performed by the Pope on a yearly basis. It had been found that these external rituals, while not necessarily directly impactful, have strengthened the belief and resolve of those inside the plane, yielding fewer casualties and shorter durations. Various experiments have been conducted to see beyond the event horizon of the gate, to see what's on the other side. Those in the plane have reported as having the name Paradise, despite never going inside. A remote-controlled rover was sent inside the gate on one experiment, but the footage was deemed far too dangerous as all those who witnessed it died within 2 months. Hopefully, you didn't peer too closely into the gate as you watched this video. The man's bedroom hadn't been silent for over 100 years now. The carpet had been worn down. A thick layer of dust had gathered on every surface, and the same trapped air had stagnated for so long that it had become unbearable for anyone entering the room. But no one was allowed to enter the room. Nobody could open that door ever again, or it could mark the beginning of not just an apocalypse, but a breakdown in the nature of reality itself. Figures shuffled around the room, sometimes dozens, sometimes as few as 3, all rotting, but never dying. Researchers peered through the window in abject terror day after day as the laws of physics broke down before their very eyes. All of them except one, a lone scientist with a plan to get inside that room. A plan that the Foundation would shoot him dead for. A plan that he was seconds away from enacting as the improvised explosive device in his satchel clunked heavily against his thigh. In many ways, we are just as trapped as SCP-001, if not more so. We are trapped in our own three-dimensional world. Take a stick figure drawn on a piece of paper. That stick figure knows up and down, left and right, and that is their world. You draw a box around them, and they are trapped, unable to simply step forward out of the page and walk around it. For us, looking down at the stick figure, we might laugh at their foolishness. Trapped inside a child's drawing of a house, it begs the question, is there a creature looking down at us and laughing? We may be able to move up and down, left and right, forward and backward, outsmarting the simple stick figure. But in time, we are just as caged in, living our entire lives on this razor-thin piece of paper called the present. The future is always just out of reach, the past always repelling us. We have no choice but to exist in the now, slowly creeping through history without any agency of our own. Cursed to be born, live, and die in that order. You can never be a child again, never see your mother's face for the first time beaming down at you. You cannot skip ahead to your dying minutes, knowing what it is you will have to face up to in your life. Maybe the idea of facing up to things at all will fade with the freedom of exploring what once was and what will be, as if it were no more difficult than taking a step out of a 2D box. The bell rang, cutting Professor Davies off. He hadn't meant to go into such an existential tangent, especially for his first-year students. Most of them looked like they were in a daze, not really listening to anything he had been saying. Quantum mechanics sure was a complex topic to cover in just one semester at university. He'd spent his entire career trying to wrap his head around it, and still spend most of his days with the same bored and confused glaze over his eyes as the teenagers who made their way to the back of the hall. But one figure, standing just beyond the doorway peering down at him, caught the professor's eye. Little did he know how drastically his career was about to change in just a few minutes. A preeminent physicist at just 28 years old, Professor Davies had already achieved the status that many academics will not see within their lifetimes. Whenever anyone asked him about it, he always made the joke that he was cheating. He didn't believe in the concept of a linear lifetime in the first place. Still too young to be taken seriously by many of his peers, he had flown under the academic radar for much of his career so far. Perhaps it was as simple as that. Or perhaps certain undercover agents had a hand in suppressing news of his blossoming career in quantum research. His hands trembled as he approached the reinforced glass. He gripped the bag tightly, trying his best not to let his fear show. If any of them saw what he was about to do, if they even suspected something, he would have a dozen bullets flying through the back of his skull before he'd even have a chance to put his hands up. Shifting his weight from foot to foot, he waited for the airlock to be opened for him. A siren blared, red lights flashed, and the first glass door slid open. Stepping inside, he waited for the atmosphere in the chamber to adjust. Both doors were closed in front of and behind him. If they wanted to kill him, now would be the time. He closed his eyes and waited with bated breath, the bomb weighing heavily on his shoulder. But they would not kill him. He knew that now. What he was about to do was inevitable. It took several months for Professor Davies to be granted the full security clearance he needed. They kept referring to his project as a K-class anomaly, whatever that meant, in order to get him up to speed with the nature of what he was going to be working on. The Foundation assigned him to various other SCPs first: SCP-5027, 2821, 1887, any instance that had some link to quantum mechanics or complex theoretical physics. They wouldn't even tell him which SCP he was being trained up to work on until one morning when a team of agents was waiting for him at the door to his quarters. He wasn't allowed to bring a bag or any personal possessions, standard issue clothing, a toothbrush, and everything else he needed would all be provided for him. It was only then that they told him which SCP he was being assigned to: SCP-001. He was blindfolded for the entirety of the journey. Car, then plane, then another car. It was a full 10 hours before his blindfold was removed and his new project was revealed to him. Professor Davies found himself in Site-01, the place where all of this started. All the SCPs, all the research, the secrecy, the assassinations, the deaths of countless innocent people, and an equal number of guilty parties. It all started right here, Site-01. The site itself resembled a large sarcophagus, similar to the one found covering the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Where do you think the Soviets got the blueprints from? Everything in the room is arranged in a circle around the center. Research desks, maintenance equipment, raw materials including a stockpile of wooden planks and reinforced metal sheets, monitoring equipment, security cameras, and of course, some of the most advanced automatic weapon systems in the world, all pointed at a great glass box in the middle of the hangar. Measuring 30 meters in each direction, the glass was 50 centimeters thick. Even all those high-caliber weapons would have had a hard time creating a chip in that. But it wasn't the glass box itself that was so interesting. It was what was trapped inside of it. A house inside a perfectly round glass bowl, with no entrances or exits, complete with a front lawn, sidewalk, porch, and even a tree in the backyard. A regular American house, trapped in a box like some kind of science experiment. There was some kind of transparent airlock system at the entrance. On the other side was just a normal walk up the garden path to the edge of the second glass bubble enclosing the house. But on closer inspection, Professor Davies realized that this wasn't your typical American house at all. The street lamp wasn't electric. It was made of iron with little glass-paned windows, an oil lamp. In fact, the house did look odd to him. There was no electric doorbell, but instead an actual physical bell system. The whole house looked out of place, not just because it was in a box in the central hangar of a 42,000-ton sarcophagus, but because it was from another era entirely. You see, Site-01 was constructed around this house. The glass box and bubble, the sarcophagus, all of it was built around the already existing building. Beneath the foundations, 100 meters beneath the surface, is an immense metal plate that forms a perfect seal with the defenses up top. The only way in and out of Site-01 is through an immense reinforced door. But even all those defenses will prove utterly futile if anyone ever opens the thin wooden door to the bedroom on the top floor of the house. That is the home and the prison in which SCP-001 is trapped. It is the job of the Foundation to make sure that it remains trapped there indefinitely. What is SCP-001? As Professor Davies made his way through the airlock for the very first time and entered the site under the supervision of 4 of the highest-ranking SCP staff alive today, he laid eyes on the entity itself for the first time. Standing on a scissor lift parked outside the front of the house, just inches away from the glass bubble, he was lifted high enough to look through the window into what looked like a young boy's bedroom on the top floor. Layers of dust coated the surfaces, black and white photos sat in frames, antique children's toys sat all around the walls, but Davies didn't notice any of them. He was too busy watching the men walking in all directions. Unhurried, but with purpose, well over a dozen men walked in all directions across the carpeted floor. They were all identical, around 6 feet, with heavy rotting skin that seemed to hang off their limbs like it would a carcass left in the sun. Human cadavers milling about in a young boy's bedroom. Davies was so taken aback by their appearance and behavior that it took him a long time to notice something truly strange. The reason he was brought here in the first place. They were walking through the bed in the middle of the room. Not just over it or around it, but straight through it, as if it wasn't there. But wait, something else was wrong too. There weren't 12 of them in the room. It was closer to 20. Had he miscounted a moment ago? Then he saw it take place. One of the cadavers reached the edge of the room and paused, as if in thought. At that moment, it split. Not in half, but rather 2 versions of itself emerged from where one had been standing, both walking in different directions. A thrill of excitement ran through Professor Davies' body. The uncertainty principle. It was there in action in front of him. He was looking at Schrodinger's cat inside the box and seeing both its corpse and its living self. Where uncertainty exists, this entity was somehow embodying both possibilities in real time. He watched the 2 selves walk around the room, following different paths for several minutes, until eventually they converged again back into one being. He turned to the researcher accompanying him, lit up with excitement, and asked what they were doing here. The researcher's face was grim when he replied, "They're pacing, waiting." The airlock door hissed open. He felt the stale 1800s air hitting his face, perfectly maintained at 20 degrees. In front of him was the garden path leading up to his goal, that glass bubble. Gripping the satchel, he set off up the path slow enough not to attract any unwarranted attention. Over the next few days, Professor Davies learned everything that the Foundation had on SCP-001. It had been a human once, a radical physicist born in the late 19th century. Intent on kickstarting the next century with a nuclear renaissance, the young man had created a working model for stable nuclear fusion. The potential ramifications were enormous. Free, clean electricity on a mass scale with no harmful byproducts. His research was almost complete when a covert private military group poisoned him with his own radioactive nuclear agent. The young man made it back to his house, where he died in his sleep that night. Powerful military personnel and prominent scientists who had been working alongside the young man knew immediately what had happened. Bursting into his home, they were about to walk through his bedroom door and save him, when they saw the shadow of 2 feet standing by the door, then another pair. The young scientist had died, but he also hadn't. Much like Schrodinger's cat, the man was suspended in a dual state of death and not death. This shocking discovery led the group of people present to form a rudimentary foundation, established to secure and contain their once friend within his room, never to be discovered by the wider world. Through close observation since this time, it has been established that SCP-001 exists independently of linear time, in a kind of superposition relative to the world around it. It is capable of occupying any space that will or has been empty at any point in time. Say you have 2 chairs in a room. One chair has always been there. The other was added to the room just 5 minutes before. The SCP is unable to walk through the chair that was always there since it has always existed, but the chair that was added can be passed through with no problem, because there was a point in time when that chair had not been there. But it also works in the future. If a third chair was present, which had always been there but was removed 5 minutes after the experiment, SCP-001 could pass through that chair also. The Foundation theorizes and hopes that the start of this clock that SCP-001 operates on was the point at which the young scientist died and did not die. That is why it is incapable of escaping its bedroom, and that is why it is of vital importance that the bedroom door remains closed forever. Ongoing maintenance work and preservation techniques are being employed to keep the house in as stable a state as possible. Should anything happen to damage the integrity of the structure, the quantum chaos contained in that space could lead to a total breakdown of the laws of physics, destroying not just the world but the fundamentals of mathematics as we know them. The bomb bumped against Professor Davies' thigh as he walked up to the house, an old man whose life had been devoted to denying the world its future. A reality where what is and what could be are just as real as one another. A world where the pain of living in the now fades, when you can travel to any moment in your life and relive its joy, when you aren't trapped by the aging process. Infinite renewable energy to solve the world's problems, a chance to see your deceased loved ones again, a way to look at the universe through the eyes of God. The head of 001 Containment, he had spent his entire career overriding all of the safeguards, tweaking containment rules just enough each year, all so he could walk across this grass with a satchel on his shoulder and an explosive more important than the atomic bomb at his hip. He approached the glass of the inner sphere. If he had done the math right, this should do just enough damage to create a hole in the containment structure. The pressure change wouldn't be too great inside, but it should be just enough to blow, say, a bedroom door wide open. It skitters in the dark, its insect-like legs tapping across the marble floors as terrified Foundation researchers flee. They hear its voice, the deep, silky tones of an elderly British man, spouting nonsense like, "The nightmare is a dream to the nameless slug that wanders across minefield in the remains of deer and kings." While the scientists run, the creature gains on them. It's fast, impossibly fast. While they still try to escape down this darkened hallway, ear-splitting containment breach sirens blast through the air. They may try to escape, but it's futile. In a sense, they're already dead. All they are now is prey for the heart of darkness. When someone says the word heart, there are a lot of images that come to mind. You might think of Valentine's Day, heart-shaped cards and candies. You might think of heartbreak, rejection, loss. You might simply think of a heart in the anatomical sense, the vital organ that pumps blood through our bodies. It's unlikely, though, that you would associate the word heart with terror, destruction, and countless deaths. However, employees of the SCP Foundation might think differently, especially if they've ever had a run-in with SCP-058. Much of the information about 058's discovery is highly classified, but the few details that are known paint a chilling picture. At an SCP Foundation test site, the day was proceeding as usual, with scientists and security personnel going about their regular daily tasks. There was no hint of danger in the air, beyond the base level that always comes with setting foot in an SCP Foundation site, at least. Several researchers were performing an experiment, the specifics of which have been expunged from all records, involving the carcass of a cow. When a researcher, Dr. C, placed his hands on the specimen and prepared to dissect it, he was shocked to feel a pulse coming from the supposedly dead animal. Dr. C shared his surprise with his colleagues, but his concerns were dismissed immediately. Clearly this was a corpse. He was imagining things, they said. After all, he was relatively new to the job. It was probably just nerves. The head researcher, Dr. L, insisted that he take over. Pushing Dr. C to the side, Dr. L began to make an incision into the animal's chest. As he did, he too felt something peculiar. There was no doubt about it. This dead cow had a beating heart. He looked up from his work to tell the other researchers to explain what he felt, but by then, it was too late. something horrible was already happening. With a stomach-churning sound of squishing flesh, the cow's heart burst from its chest and flopped onto the floor. It was terrifyingly large, and all the doctors jumped back from the sight of it. 4 spindly, spider-like legs poked through the flesh of the heart, and it began to quickly skitter about the room. Researchers reviewing the security footage would later note that it didn't just move randomly. It seemed agitated, angry at being discovered, and it displayed immediate hostility towards the scientists in the room. 4 tentacles next unfurled from within the heart and stretched out into full, writhing appendages. They moved frighteningly fast as the heart whipped around the room and were coated in sharp spines. Finally, a stinger poked out from the back of the heart, where the whole of the superior vena cava should be. All of the scientists leapt into action, with one reaching for a scalpel and another moving towards the door. But before the men could so much as call for help, the tentacles wrapped around them and ripped them to shreds. Hearing screams coming from the laboratory, security personnel arrived to contain the threat. However, they were no match for the strange creature that would soon be known as SCP-058. It tore through the security team in minutes, leaving their tattered remains in its wake. Much to the horror of the surviving personnel at the site, SCP-058 was able to escape containment and make its way to a neighboring town. Reports of the incident said that, when the creature reached the town, you could hear the screaming for miles. SCP-058 carved a path of violence through the town, attacking everything in sight with its stinger and tentacles, and leaving a trail of strange fluid from its stinger. Dozens of citizens were killed, and 70% of the buildings were completely destroyed. When agents were dispatched to the location to retrieve the creature, they were shocked to see the level of destruction caused by something so small. The scent of blood and smoke filled the air, and severed limbs littered the ground alongside splintered wood and collapsed brick. The survivors removed from the wreckage were inconsolable, only calming down once they were given an amnestic to erase their memory of the encounter with SCP-058. They had to be given new lives as well, as there was nothing left of their old ones. SCP Foundation agents were only able to capture and contain SCP-058 after it was crushed by pieces of a building that collapsed on top of it. They found it flattened under a slab of stone, legs flailing uselessly, tentacles limp. The agents were able to safely remove the debris and bring in the heart without any more casualties that day. Once it was brought into captivity, the heart was contained for 3 weeks and remained largely quiet during that time. It was almost inconceivable that this small creature hadn't been killed in the incident, but the Foundation would soon learn that this creature was freakishly durable. It escaped once more while being transferred to an SCP containment site, again causing injuries and death. Having only experienced SCP-058 in its docile injured form, the team responsible for the transfer was unprepared for the sheer power and violence the creature was capable of. It was able to escape an armored car and make its way into a forest, where it eviscerated several squirrels and rabbits. Or rather, they were believed to be squirrels and rabbits. The remains were too mutilated to properly identify. It was only finally apprehended after being crushed by an armored tank. But even this didn't kill the creature, and it was transferred to Armed Biocontainment Area 14, where it remains to this day. There is a great deal about SCP-058 that is horrifying, but there is one attribute it has shown in captivity that would make even the most seasoned researcher's skin crawl. Though it has no anatomical capacity for speech, no throat, vocal cords, or even a respiratory system, SCP-058 speaks. Not only does it speak, but it speaks constantly, in the deep voice of an elderly British man. No one knows who the voice might belong to, or if it belongs to anyone at all. Perhaps it belongs only to SCP-058 somehow. As is often the case with SCPs that are capable of speech, there have been multiple attempts to interview the creature, and each time, it ended in complete disaster. The only interview with an available transcript, Interview 05804, was conducted by Dr. Johnston with several personnel in the room for additional security. Dr. Johnston attempted to get at the origins of the creature, asking for its name and where it was from. The creature responded in cryptic, unsettling poetry, giving answers to simple questions with, I had dreams of the Queen, wonders that lived inside the hearts of love, and silent treatments for all the elderly that I knew were once whole. After the fourth recitation of a similar verse from the heart, Personnel D067 made a comment on the creepy nature of its responses, almost as if it was offended by the remark. SCP-058 immediately stretched a tentacle across the room, wrapped it around D067 and lifted him into the air. He began screaming and clawing at the tentacle in an attempt to free himself as his fellow personnel tried to help him. They grabbed at the tentacle, but found their hands pierced and bloodied by the spikes that cover it. Dr. Johnston commanded 058 to let him go, but it did not oblige. Instead, the man was crushed to death by the tentacle, and his limp body left to drop to the floor. The interview concluded with a single statement from the nightmarish heart. The sensual violence of lust is all the assurance you will ever need to know the worth of life. SCP-058 never seems to say anything that has to do with the people or events around it. It speaks in the same haunting, poetic language even when it's attacking or killing something. No matter what happens to it, what is done to it, or what anyone says, SCP-058 keeps talking, and its tone of voice with the pace of speech never changing, and further attempts to interview it have been abandoned due to the safety risk involved. So what happened to the creature often called the Heart of Darkness? Where is it now? SCP-058 is kept in an isolated containment chamber made of reinforced heat-resistant steel with a backing of reinforced concrete. In order to placate its bloodthirsty, carnivorous tendencies, the creature is given a live cow every 3 days. It is uncertain how exactly SCP-058 eats, given that it does not have a mouth or stomach, but every time it is finished with a cow, only bones remain. Routine maintenance is conducted on a tight schedule, and the heart is never allowed out of its containment area under any circumstances. After 2 previous escapes from containment, the Foundation is not taking any chances. Its constant speech is recorded via audio devices that are running at all times. Out of concern for their safety and mental health, no personnel are permitted to listen to recordings of SCP-058 speaking for more than 30 minutes at a time. It is unknown what will happen to someone who listens for longer, but it has been suggested that the consequences could be dire. If the creature ever escapes again, the containment site is ordered to be destroyed via the detonation of an on-site nuclear weapon. Under no circumstances can it be allowed to make its way out into the world again. Even with all these precautions in place, SCP-058 has been responsible for over 150 deaths at its current containment site. There are some at the Foundation who have campaigned for SCP-058 to be terminated, believing that there is more harm than good done by keeping it alive. However, all attempts to terminate it have so far failed. No matter how much physical trauma the heart suffers, it does not seem to be able to be killed. It can only be incapacitated for a short time. There is a classic horror story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Telltale Heart. In it, a man murders an old man and buries his body beneath the floorboards of his home. There, even though the old man is certainly dead, the murderer swears he can hear the beating of the heart coming up through the floorboards. No matter what he does to quiet the sound, he cannot escape it, and is eventually driven mad by the incessant beating of the dead man's heart. SCP-058 may not be a man's heart, a human heart, or even a real heart at all. However, just like the Telltale Heart, it continues to impossibly beat no matter how hard anyone tries to stop it. The steady thump of its pulse haunts the SCP Foundation, a grim reminder that there is something within its walls that can, and will, kill everyone it can if given the chance. It couldn't be destroyed by collapsed buildings, an armored tank, or an army of experts, and the contingency plan of a nuclear blast is not even guaranteed to work. It is entirely possible that, once the facility has been laid waste and all the staff have been incinerated, and the smoke has finally cleared, the Heart of Darkness will still be there, still beating, still talking, and still killing. Have you ever had a nightmare that you're running down a long, dark hallway, getting chased by something you can't see? The thing behind you isn't fast, but that doesn't matter. You can't run forever, and the thing knows it. It is a patient predator, It toys with its food. At first, you move with speed and rhythm. The metallic scraping noise behind you grows quieter. You run and stumble through the dark. Your muscles start to ache and your lungs burn. Your pace slows. It's still coming. You can hear the scraping getting louder. You start to panic. It's completely dark. You don't know where you're running or even what you're running from. All you know, as you bump against the walls and the sharp corners that rush towards you, is that you can't run forever. You trip, fall, and pain explodes through your legs as your knee shatters on the concrete ground. That scraping is getting louder. You can barely breathe. You can't run anymore with your injury. There's no way to stop what's coming. There is no escape. The scraping is right behind you. You scream, and then you wake up. Your heart is pounding like thunder in your chest, and your sheets are soaked with sweat, but you're safe. You're out of those awful dark hallways. But what if this wasn't just a nightmare? What if this scenario was real, and there was no escape from the horror chasing you in the darkness? That's what it's like to have a close encounter with SCP-1918, a sadistic sentient object that loves playing twisted games with its prey. But this monster never plays fair, and even worse, it's always just a simple door away. It may even be hiding behind a door near you right now, waiting to start a game with its new playmate. But soon you'll understand why some doors should never, ever be opened, and why some games are better left unplayed. SCP-1918 is an anomaly with two parts: SCP-1918 itself and SCP-1918-2. The monster's underground lair. The duo are a match made in hell, as the chambers and hallways of 1918-2 are perfectly tailored to 1918's violent hobbies. Nobody knows how long this anomaly has been operating, but it's probably behind countless disappearances. After all, 1918 has a habit of breaking its toys. The nightmare began in a small town in Maine, with a population of only 226 people. But that population was about to get lower. People in the town began to report strange noises at night, a droning metal-on-concrete scraping noise, like someone dragging a lead pipe along the ground. At first, people just ignored the sound. It was all in their heads, or maybe just a faulty oven or a washing machine on the fritz. Anything that would allow them to forget about the noise and get on with their daily lives. But the noises were coming from below. They could be heard out on the streets, most audibly near manholes and sewer grates. People started feeling unsafe in their homes. The noises were spooking animals and children. People were losing sleep. That scraping they all tried to ignore was beginning to get to them all. Letters, emails, and angry phone calls to the town council were piling up. Something had to be done before the whole town went crazy with fear. The mayor authorized 4 utility workers to investigate the source of the noise at a local sewage treatment facility. Considering the scraping was loudest near the sewer grates, everyone just assumed that whatever was causing all this must be connected to the sewers. 4 utility workers were sent to investigate the facility, only to find that the machinery on site was working just fine. The source of the problems must have been coming directly from the underground sewer lines themselves. The 4 workers, equipped with headlamps, descended into a long service tunnel that fed into the sewer system. As they passed deeper into the tunnel, the darkness around them became thicker. It was a tangible presence that drowned out the light of their headlamps, similar to the anomalous phenomenon exhibited by SCP-087. When the utility workers tried to turn back, they discovered another impossibility. It seemed that the tunnel behind them had become a solid concrete wall. They were trapped, but where? It was too dark to tell. Confused and terrified, the 4 men stuck together, attempting to find a way out. It was too dark to see their hand in front of their face, so all they could do was navigate slowly by feeling the walls around them. These walls felt old, crusty. There was a kind of faint metallic stench hanging in the air too, like old blood. Something horrible had happened here, and something horrible was about to happen again. All they could do was keep moving and try to stay calm. Eventually, after hours of pawing at the walls in the dark, they found an open doorway. One by one, they filed inside, only to feel blinded when bright white ceiling lights suddenly switched on. The room was all white and filled with pipes, large and small, running from wall to wall. Just then, one of the utility workers let out an ear-splitting scream and pointed towards the doorway. His colleagues turned and gasped in shock. There was something outside the door, and it was staring at them. The object filled up almost the entire doorway. It seemed like a demonic hobby horse, made from a black and white candy-striped metal pole with a crude plastic head on top. The head looked like a clown's with a wide, toothy grin, but no visible eyes. It was SCP-1918. The utility workers were frozen as the object leaned forward slightly and slithered into the room, the bottom of the metal pipe scraping against the ground. It was the exact same scraping noise that had been haunting the concerned townsfolk up above. This was the thing behind it all, and as the object moved, its metal pole started to scrape words into the ground. Tic-tac-toe. None of the 4 utility workers were ever seen again. It didn't take long for the SCP Foundation to descend upon this quiet main town and pick up the pieces. All relevant officials were provided amnestics, and cover stories were created for the disappearances of the 4 utility workers. The Foundation also commandeered the sewage treatment facility that held the entrance to SCP-1918-2. Replacing all key roles at the facility with undercover Foundation personnel. SCP-1918 was given a Euclid classification due to the fixed nature of its hunting grounds, and then the real research began. The Foundation soon made some disturbing discoveries. Entrances into the SCP-1918-2 area didn't follow any kind of logic. The hunting ground of SCP-1918 can be entered from almost any location, if you're unlucky enough. There are currently 9 known entrances, including 5 sewage grates, 3 utility shafts located in a sewage facility, and 1 toilet. And these are just the ones that the Foundation knows about. There are a huge number of ways to enter SCP-1918-2, but to this day, nothing has ever been able to leave. SCP-1918-2 is contained 20 meters below the streets of this unassuming main town. Personnel, aside from Foundation-approved D-Class guinea pigs, are refused entrance. Researchers have mapped out the layout of 1918-2 through seismic imaging of SCP-1918's movements. There are 18 identical room pairs in SCP-1918-2, or 9 compound rooms. Rooms are differentiated between a 1-room and a 2-room by crude carvings on the floors outside of the individual rooms. SCP-1918-2 is symmetrical, with half-a-meter wide paths circling each compound room. The only deviation to this construction are the location of entrances on the sides of each individual room, which vary randomly while the location is active. What exactly does SCP-1918 do in this private little maze? It plays games, of course. Its 2 favorites, as indicated by the words it scrapes into the ground, are tic-tac-toe and memory. In tic-tac-toe, 1918 moves to each 1 room, leaving behind X markings on the floors if the room is not already marked with an O, in a manner similar to a game of tic-tac-toe. How a victim is meant to accomplish making a mark or understanding this process is unknown, as no aids are given. Blood is commonly used by victims to make their markings, hence the rusty smell in many of the rooms. In memory, the trapped victim is rendered unconscious by blunt force, presumably from SCP-1918. The subject regains consciousness in a random section of the facility. Success is marked by finding a 1-room identical to the central room. This event seems to possess a time limit, as the subject is pursued by SCP-1918 through the halls of the facility. The subject wins by marking the correct room with an O. What happens if you win or lose these games? It's important to note that SCP-1918 is very competitive and doesn't play fair. If you win, the object will merely accuse you of cheating and start a new game. This will happen again and again until eventually you lose. And what do? Well, take the horrifying encounter D-Class personnel member D-2934 had with SCP-1918. Wearing video and audio equipment, D-2934 was led into SCP-1918-2 by Foundation researchers. When he eventually found his way to the central room, 1918 challenged him to a game of tic-tac-toe, and against all odds, D-2934 won the game. but 1918 didn't take kindly to that. It accused D-2934 of cheating, carving its accusations into the ground before challenging him to a deadly game of memory. After hours of chasing, D-2934 eventually lost his mind and was backed into a corner by 1918. As the object made its way towards him, he panicked, ripped a pipe from the wall, and began smashing 1918's head. As the plastic cracked under the force of the blows, Foundation scientists could see real brains inside. D-2934 screamed, and the video feed cut off. When the video turned back on sometime later, 1918 stared into the camera with a different head mounted atop its metal pole, one that just a few hours earlier had belonged to the unfortunate D-2934. If there's one lesson to be learned from this terrifying anomaly, it's that there truly is no escape from SCP-1918. Captain Francis Pike leads his team across the Arctic tundra. In the distance, they can see the city of Audapaupadopolis. It floats 7.8 kilometers above the ground and is filled with mysteries and treasures beyond even the Foundation's wildest dreams. It is September of 1933 when the SCP Foundation first catches winds of something odd going on in the Arctic. A British airman named Sir George Danson flies over the North Sea heading to Norway. After he lands in Oslo, Danson begins ranting about a floating city. The Foundation immediately disseminates contradictory information and manipulates the story to include that Danson had been drinking during his flight. So everything he is saying is probably the result of a drunken hallucination. While SCP agents spread lies, the Foundation immediately launches an investigation. The team that is sent to the Arctic confirms what Danson claims to have seen. There is indeed a floating city there. Now Captain Pike and his team stare at the island in the sky as their hot air balloons are filled behind them. The Arctic wind whips up small snow tornadoes as the temperature plummets. The balloons are ready, and Pike orders his men to board. They lift off from the ground and pull their parka hoods over their heads to protect them from the Arctic blasts at high altitudes. Pike and his team slowly drift over the city of Audapaupadopolis. When they are somewhat in the middle of the floating island, the hot air balloons are lowered and the team lands without incident. To their surprise, the exploratory team finds that the floating city has its own microclimate, which is much more pleasant than the frigid Arctic. They remove their winter gear. "Proceed with caution," Pike tells his men. "We have no idea what we're going to find in the city." The architecture is clearly old, but not exactly like anything on Earth today. It seems to be a conglomerate of ancient Mesopotamian design mixed with the design features of several other cultures. Many of the buildings that line the stone streets are crumbling, and the city overall is in ruins. Pike leads his team down a series of roads. Scientists photograph and take notes of the city for Foundation records. SCP agents check around every corner to make sure there is nothing hiding in the shadows. The team comes to a crossroads. "Halt!" Pike shouts. Standing in front of them is an old man with long gray hair and a white beard. He seems to be of Middle Eastern descent. "Hello, friends," the old man says. "Welcome to Audapaupadopolis. I am the caretaker of the city. I've been expecting you. Please follow me." The old man turns around and proceeds down the causeway. Pike hesitates for a moment. "Stay alert," he whispers to the agents behind him. Then he begins to follow the old man down the street. As Pike walks, he takes in the grandeur that the city once held. The roads are as wide as the main avenues back in London, while the buildings, although in shambles, still retain some of their ancient beauty. Pike begins to walk a little faster to catch up with the old man. "What happened here?" he asks. The man turns his head. "All will be revealed soon, Francis Pike. Just be patient." "How do you know my name?" asks Pike. The old man smiles. They turn another corner and in front of them is the Grand Hall. It seems to have survived whatever catastrophe befell the rest of the city. Pike stops and stares up at the massive structure with his mouth ajar. "Come," says the old man, as he motions the SCP team to follow him up the steps into the main hall. "Let's eat." The old man prepares a simple meal, but one that fills the stomachs and satisfies Pike and his men. At the conclusion of the meal, Captain Pike approaches the mysterious man. "I feel like you deserve an explanation as to who we are and why we're here," Pike says. The old man raises his hand. "You are from the Foundation," he replies. "I already know about the Foundation and you, Francis Pike.
I have been waiting for you to arrive for a long time. There are things I need to show you in the city. There are old secrets and ancient relics from the past that you were sent here to learn about."
Pike looks at the man and squints. "What are you talking about? How could you know we were coming? And what relics are you referring to exactly?" The old man grins and places a hand on Captain Pike's shoulder. Pike feels a longing emotion well up inside of him. It's as if he has been waiting for this moment his whole life.
"Come," says the old man. "You and your men need rest."
He shows Pike and the exploration team to several rooms down the hallway where they can set up for the night. The rooms are large and comfortable.
"Sleep well, Francis Pike. Tomorrow I have much to show you."
The old man leaves the room and proceeds down the hallway to his small, humble chamber. The next morning, Pike and the other SCP agents are greeted by the rising sun and the old man waiting for them on the steps of the Grand Hall. He leads them through the city.
"There are 3 temples I wish to show you," the old man says to Pike. "You will notice that their architecture and imagery differ from most of the other structures in the city. Make sure you listen very carefully, Francis Pike, as what you're about to learn could save the universe, or perhaps destroy it."
Pike is speechless. All he can do is nod his head. The old man leads the SCP agents to the middle of the city where the 3 temples reside. Each one has its own unique iconography and style. The art seems to reflect important events in history or subjects that hold significance in the past. The old man proceeds to walk towards the first temple. Upon entering the structure, there is a mural of 2 naked people watching the horizon from a tree line. Behind them are a wolf and bear that seem to be protectively standing guard. Directly opposite of this picture is a painting of a figure holding a flaming sword on a hill. As Pike and his team enter the main hall, they are welcomed by a gigantic mural depicting the sun rising over Audapaupadopolis.
"This is where the Temple of Sunrise gets its name,"
the old man says, gesturing to the mural on the far wall. Below the sunrise is a golden man holding a spear with a silver point. He wears a shining crown. Pike can't help but notice that the man in the mural looks similar to their guide, just a lot younger.
Perhaps it's his son or a relative,
Pike thinks to himself. Above the sunrise is a dragon with green eyes. Engraved across the dragon's body are the words, "They will know what is." The other walls contain images of the same golden man. In one picture, he stands at the foot of a throne with a naked woman wrapped in snakes behind him. On another, the golden man sits on the throne with an iron crown hovering above his head. Behind him are monoliths of 5 figures. One is made of gears and steel. Another is made of flesh and blood. The third is made of ice and stone. The fourth is made of stars. And the final is made of eyes. The SCP agents in the room begin to buzz with excitement. They start recording everything they see.
"We must continue on," the old man says. "There isn't much time left."
Pike nods and orders a small team to stay behind to continue documenting the Temple of Sunrise. The next building they enter is the Temple of Sunset. Within the walls are maps of different towns and landscapes. One of the maps is Audapaupadopolis itself. The words, "The Lands of Men," are scrolled over the map in the entry hall. The old man stops at the opening to the main gallery.
"Prepare yourself, Francis Pike. What you are about to witness will not be pleasant."
They head into the next room where the temperature immediately shoots up.
"What the hell is producing all of that heat?"
Pike asks. There is nothing but crumbling walls and fallen columns visible in the room. One of the scientists hollers from the back of the group.
"Jesus! Sir, I think you need to take a look at this!"
He walks up to Pike and hands him a pair of thermal imaging goggles. Pike puts them on.
"Damn,"
Pike mutters. With the thermal lenses on, he can now see a massive humanoid entity lying dead on the floor. His body is so large that it covers the murals on 3 of the walls. Pike notices that the temperature in the room is still continuing to increase as the dead giant is radiating heat. The Foundation classifies the entity as SCP-4840-B. It has 6 arms and 6 legs, each connected by metal chains to iron flails at the end. A sigil has been brandished into the middle of the entity's chest.
"What is that?"
Pike asks. The old man just shakes his head.
"One of the many who have fallen,"
he responds. The old man points to the only wall that is not blocked by the massive body of SCP-4840-B and frowns. The golden man is depicted here as well. Pike can't help but feel there is some sort of connection between Audapaupadopolis, the old man, and the golden figure he keeps seeing in the murals. In the Temple of Sunset, The Golden Man sits atop a white horse with his iron crown resting on his head. Behind him is a massive army of men and women, holding axes and swords. Across from the Golden Man and his army are legions of green and gray figures with 6 eyes dressed in brilliantly colored clothing. An intense lightning storm appears to be amassing in the distance. Captain Pike looks up to the ceiling to see it covered in stars. However, he does not recognize any of the constellations. "Is the Golden Man I keep seeing you?" But before Pike can finish his question, the old man cuts him off. "We must be going!" He turns and exits the temple. Pike does not want to push the old man. He seems to be a wealth of knowledge, and the only way to learn more about Audapaupadopolis and what it all means. They exit the Temple of Sunset and continue to the final structure in the middle of the city. The old man leads Pike and the rest of the SCP agents to the smallest temple of the 3. He stops just outside of the doorway. "This is the Temple of the Night," he proclaims. "What you see on the surface is deceiving. This temple goes deep underground. It contains a labyrinth of passages that one could get lost in forever, so please be careful." "Are you coming?" Pike asks. "No," responds the old man. "I do not enter the Temple of Night. I have my reasons, which do not concern you." Pike nods, and then signals his men to follow him into the temple. He notices that many of the murals in the passageways and rooms of the Temple of Night depict the same image of a massive tree in the middle of a vast forest. In each instance of the tree, there seem to be red lights surrounding the base, human-like figures hanging from its branches, and structures wrapped in vines surrounding the trunk. The hallways are illuminated by some unknown light source. It is as if torches line the walls and give off a dull yellowish glow, but there is no fire to be seen. Embedded in the walls are sarcophagi, with intricate carvings in their stone casings. Pike can't help but notice scratching sounds coming from within the sarcophagi, as if someone, or something, is trying to claw its way out. The exploration team reaches the innermost chamber of the temple. There is a staircase in the middle of the room that descends below the floor. However, its entrance is covered by rubble from a collapsed wall. Suddenly, an SCP agent runs up to Captain Pike. "Sir, I think you should see this." Pike follows the man back through a series of twists and turns. He stops at a closed door. The Foundation seal is carved into the wood. It seems as if the carving has been there for a long time, which is impossible since they are the first SCP team to explore the city of Audapaupadopolis. The agent pushes open the door and Pike steps in. He is astonished by what he finds. It seems he has been transported to an abandoned Foundation site. All of the lights are off, but he can tell that it is some kind of central command center due to the screens and setup of the space. Painted in black block letters on one of the walls is Site 000000. Pike quickly exits back through the entryway and shuts the door behind him. He looks at the SCP agent who brought him into the room. "Secure this door and make sure no one gets in or comes out. Do I make myself clear?" Pike orders his men to exit the temple. After everyone comes out, Captain Pike walks over to the old man who is sitting on the steps outside. "Did you find what you were looking for, Francis Pike?" the old man asks. Captain Pike shakes his head. He stares down, eyes wide, at the stone steps of the temple. "I see," says the old man. "I have something else to show you, Francis Pike." The old man leads Pike to the grand hall that they had slept in the night before. He brings him through a series of passageways and down a staircase. They stop in front of a large door. "Open it," the old man whispers. Captain Francis Pike walks up to the door and pushes it open. On the other side is endless darkness, from which he hears his own voice speaking to him through the ether. Pike begins to walk towards the darkness. The old man places his hand on Pike's shoulder and pulls him back. Then he shuts the door. "The light of the world has long since left that place, and mortal man can no longer walk it," says the old man. "I needed to show it to you as a warning. Things are not always what they seem, Francis Pike." That night, Pike lies awake staring at the ceiling of the grand hall, thinking about the old man. He sits up and begins jotting down his thoughts. In his official report, he identifies the old man as SCP-4840-A, but in his journal, he can't help but refer to him as a friend. There is something about the old man, something special. Pike knows there is much more to his story, and the story of the flying city of Audapaupadopolis. A team of archaeologists uncovers a giant ceramic vase in the ruins of an ancient Greek city. They carefully brush away the sand and debris that surrounds it. The head archaeologist grabs a ladder and places it gently against the 8-foot-tall vase. "I'm gonna see if there's anything inside," he says. The archaeologist climbs the ladder and peers over the lip of the ceramic vase. The inside is completely black. "I can't see anything," he shouts down to the rest of the team. He reaches his arm into the pot to see if he can feel anything. A couple of seconds later, he releases a yelp of pain.
"Something bit me!"
he yells. The archaeologist pulls his hand out of the darkness and climbs down the ladder.
"Is there an animal inside?"
a fellow archaeologist asks. But before the question can be answered, the ceramic vase begins to shake. Thousands of tiny creatures resembling a rat mixed with a pug flood out of the top of the vase. They start clawing and biting the archaeologists. The men run away screaming in terror. Many are consumed by the wave of creatures. Others are overwhelmed as they try to scramble up the ruins to safety. Only minutes after the lead archaeologist stuck his hand into the ceramic vase, the screams are silenced. The creatures wander aimlessly around the ancient Greek city. The SCP Foundation hears of the incident and sends a team to investigate. They classify the anomalous vase as SCP-019. When they arrive on the scene, the thousands of creatures that were manifested from the vase are found dead. These entities are designated SCP-019-2 and incinerated before any tourists visiting the archaeological site see the corpses. The extraction team examines the vase itself. It seems like a normal, although very large, ceramic from antiquity. The scientists put in charge of securing SCP-019 are Dr. Light and Dr. Vox. "Be careful," Light says. "We don't know what the connection is between the vase and these creatures. It seems as if they came out of it, but our instruments aren't detecting anything inside and there's no way they could have all fit into that thing anyway." Dr. Vox, who is closely examining the vase, comes to the same conclusion. They take a step back as the extraction team prepares to put ropes in place to move SCP-019. A rope is thrown over the vase. Part of it lands on top of the lip. Instantly, an instance of SCP-019-2 appears from the ceramic. It begins running around, clawing and biting anything it can, but is eventually captured by Dr. Vox. "Well, now we know where the creatures came from. We'll bring it back to the lab for further study," the doctor says as he hands the creature off to one of the agents. The ropes are secured and the team begins to move the vase, but with every moment, another SCP-019-2 instance appears from the artifact. "This is gonna get really annoying," says Dr. Light. "Let's put the whole damn thing in a mobile containment chamber and let those little creatures run on top of each other rather than us chasing them around." "Agreed," replies Vox. A containment pod is brought in. The team quickly moves SCP-019 into it, as instance after instance of SCP-019-2 manifests from the vase. The doors to the pod are sealed. Light and Vox watch hundreds of small creatures run around inside. They bring the vase secured in the containment pod back to the SCP Foundation site, where it can be studied further. It is transferred to a containment chamber where it is observed by Light and Vox. After a few days, SCP-019 slows the manifestation rate of the SCP-019-2 creatures. When the vase was first secured, agents were ordered to shoot the creatures on sight, but the number of bullets being used was unreasonable, so they resorted to flamethrowers. The doctors decided the best course of action is to put SCP-019 into a room hooked up to an incinerator. This way, if too many creatures are manifested, they can all be burnt to a crisp with the push of a button. Dr. Vox can't help but think that this must have been what Captain Kirk felt like on the Starship Enterprise when it became infested with tribbles. Eventually, it is discovered that as long as SCP-019 is kept at 0 degrees Celsius and no one goes near it, the object only manifests one creature per hour. This is much easier to manage than the hordes of SCP-019-2 instances that came out of the vase previously. Doctors Light and Vox observe and collect data on SCP-019 through a glass viewport that looks into its containment chamber. The incinerator is turned on at least every 24 hours just to clear the room of creatures. When they are not working with the vase itself, the doctors examine SCP-019-2 entities to try and understand what they are and what they want. They capture one of the creatures and put it in a reinforced pen. Light and Vox provide the specimen with live chickens for food and as much water as the creature can drink. The noises that SCP-019-2 makes sounds like muffled sets of words. When linguists are brought in, they determine that the vocalizations are phonetically similar to ancient Hellenic languages. This is consistent with what was spoken at the ancient Greek city, where the ceramic vase was found. The doctors gave the specimen a series of puzzles to solve. It can make its way through a maze to find a piece of chicken, but when it is given opportunities to show its sentience, SCP-019-2 always falls short. Dr. Light and Dr. Vox determined the creatures are about as intelligent as lab rats. One of the most peculiar things is that SCP-019-2 instances only live for less than 48 hours. No matter how much food, water, or care is given to the creatures, they drop dead in a day or two after being manifested. Dr. Light moves one of the dead critters to an operating room where it can be dissected. She cuts down the middle of its stomach with a scalpel and peels the skin and muscle away. "Well, that explains that," she says to the other researchers standing in the room. "The muscles seem to degrade rapidly from the instant SCP-019-2 is manifested into our world. There is basically no digestive tract other than a mouth and throat, but the most surprising thing is the complete lack of internal organs." Dr. Vox pushes the intercom button from the viewing room in which he is observing the procedure. "What do you mean there are no internal organs? It must have some sort of brain and cardiovascular system." "Yeah, but that's about it," Dr. Light responds. "There appears to be a very simple central nervous system with a brain the size of a pea and a heart, but nothing else. This creature can't metabolize the food it eats or filter out toxins, and I have no idea how it breathes. We need to run more tests." With each new specimen that's examined, the results are the same. The creatures aren't very intelligent. They die in under 48 hours, and they lack pretty much any internal organs. Then one day, everything changes for the worst. The guard posted to watch over SCP-019 notes something strange occurred during his shift. Without fail, the vase manifests an instance of SCP-019-2 every hour, but around 3 a.m., no creature was generated. Or at least that's what appeared to happen. The guard puts on protective equipment and enters the room to get a closer look, but there is nothing there. He locks up, records the anomaly, and returns to the viewing glass to continue his watch. Over the next hour, the vase manifests a creature as if everything is back to normal. The next day, Light and Vox arrive at work to find everything in chaos. The power in different sections of the facility is failing. It is as if something has gotten into the ducts and is chewing through the wiring. A team of agents uses thermal imaging devices to track down the entity that is causing all the mayhem. They bring it back to the research lab. "Take a look at this," the agent says, pointing at an empty operating table. He hands Dr. Light his thermal imaging goggles. Without them, there appears to be nothing on the table, but when she looks through the device, she can see an instance of SCP-019-2. "My God," Dr. Light whispers. "They're evolving." The creature is exactly the same as all the others, except this one is invisible. Suddenly, an alarm goes off and red warning lights turn on across the facility. Light rips off the goggles and looks at Dr. Vox. "We need to get back to the vase now," she yells. They sprint out of the operating room and down the hall. As they turn the corner, they hear gunshots and the spray of fire from flamethrowers. On the other side of the corridor where SCP-019 is contained, there are agents battling with thousands of instances of SCP-019-2. The flamethrowers that had been so effective at killing the creatures now appear useless. It is as if the creatures have evolved some sort of protective skin to combat the flames. "Oh no," gasps Dr. Light. "We gotta get out of here." She grabs Dr. Vox's shoulder and drags him with her as she runs down the hall. Behind them, the scream of agents can be heard. They are quickly muffled as thousands upon thousands of SCP-019-2 creatures overwhelm them. Light glances behind her to see what is happening. What she finds is a wall of creatures rushing towards her. There must be millions now. It seems like SCP-019 was tired of being contained by the Foundation and has sent an invasion force to escape its captors. "We're not going to make it!" Vox yells. He stumbles and falls to the ground. Dr. Light skids to a stop and turns to go back for him, but it's too late. The wave of SCP-019-2 is closing in. She watches in horror as Dr. Vox is consumed by the mass of creatures. She turns and continues to run. The exit is in sight. Dr. Light makes a dash towards the door. She can feel the tiny feet of the creatures clawing at her heels. She gives it everything she's got and accelerates, putting some distance between her and the millions of SCP-019-2 entities. Dr. Light slams through the exit door and immediately closes it behind her. She manages to slide the metal locking bar into place. The impact from the wave of creatures against the door sends her stumbling backwards. She is safe now. As Light lays on the ground panting and staring at the door, she thinks to herself, well, they'll all be dead in a couple of days, and then we can try again. It has long been the mission of the SCP Foundation to secure and contain any anomalies they encounter, all to protect the safety of the human race. Sometimes containing an SCP is a trivial task, as simple as guarding a room or keeping an eye on an artifact with strange but mostly harmless properties. Other times, though, anomalies require a considerable number of the Foundation's personnel and resources to keep them under control. This latter category commonly includes some of the most dangerous creatures and entities that the SCP Foundation keeps under lock and key. However, while it might be only in very rare cases, every so often an SCP comes along with its very own built-in method of containment. This can often be the result of someone encountering an anomaly and discovering the perfect way of imprisoning it before the SCP Foundation comes along and steals all the credit. Undoubtedly, this makes the job of securing an anomaly all the easier for the Foundation's staff. After all, someone else has already done the hard part of the job for them. Or rather, it would make things easier if only the Foundation's own researchers chose not to interfere, and could leave a deadly threat kept safely in its box without trying to find out what makes it tick. SCP-5001 is, in some ways, a reminder that some things are best left alone, but it is also a grave warning not to tamper with that which you do not understand. Both of these lessons would soon be imparted on the SCP Foundation. Buried 60 kilometers below the ground in northern Russia is SCP-5001, a 53-kilometer wide structure. It is an enormous biomechanical machine, but to the untrained eye there is nothing anomalous about the object. And according to the Foundation's findings, this is indeed the case. There is nothing inherently anomalous about the structure itself. But there are a number of characteristics that seem to suggest it is, in some way, connected to anomalous phenomena. For one, there's the sheer scale of the structure, and then there's the records that were uncovered about SCP-5001, which appear to have been monitoring and tracking its status. Perhaps whoever constructed it or discovered it kept a record as they observed the structure. Nothing too out of the ordinary about that. But what's strange is that these date back to 11,000 BC. And yet were somehow made with modern systems of measurement. And other weirder documents have been recovered from inside of SCP-5001. Records written in languages from all over the world, and even some in languages lost to time. Among them are papers in Phoenician, Ancient Hebrew, both Ancient and Modern Greek, Latin, Anglo-Saxon, along with Modern Russian, English, and Mandarin. Some of these documents are even written in languages that the SCP Foundation's top researchers are yet to properly identify. The explanation for all this would seem obvious, wouldn't it? Writing in both ancient and contemporary languages, records that date all the way back to the last of the prehistoric era, it all seems to point in a certain direction. Somehow, SCP-5001 has a link to time travel. Perhaps it was even a hub for a group of time travelers, right? Wrong. The Foundation already thought that this might be the case and checked for any signs of temporal anomalies. And yet, they found nothing. No evidence to suggest that there had ever been any time travel near or using SCP-5001. There were no devices on site that could affect time, and no traces of any residue or fallout from a temporal occurrence. So what exactly does this thing even do? Well, we're afraid to say the Foundation researchers have been stumped on the answer to that question too, and they are not the only ones either. Way back in the 50s, the GRU's Division P also had an interest in SCP-5001. For anyone who isn't already acquainted with them, they are one of the SCP Foundation's numerous groups of interest, a list of organizations, corporations, and agencies from around the world who have also had dealings with anomalies. In the case of GRU-P, they were originally a division of the Russian Army during the Cold War. The specialty of GRU Division P was the acquisition of anomalous objects and entities. In other words, they were the Soviet Union's very own SCP Foundation. In 1953, GRU Division P was alerted to abnormal seismic activity in a narrow region of northern Russia. A team was immediately sent in to investigate and began attempting to take seismic measurements of the area in question. During their various experiments and tests, GRU Division P realized a discrepancy in their readings. Again and again, they checked and double-checked their results, only to discover that this reading wasn't the result of faulty equipment or even human error. There was something big nearby. What they hadn't yet realized was around 30 kilometers away, deep underground, was SCP-5001. Immediately, GRU Division P began drilling towards the location of SCP-5001, but for years found that they were unable to breach the exterior of the structure. Defeated, the project was abandoned in 1955. However, Soviet leader First Secretary Khrushchev seemed to have a vested interest in gaining access to SCP-5001. As a result, he privately funded the GRU Division P operation, allowing them to continue their work in secret for a number of years, from 1959 until Khrushchev was disposed in 1964. Of course, this was all during the height of the Cold War, but by the late 1960s, international relations between the Soviet Union and the United States of America were starting to ease. Thanks to the relaxing tensions, a contract was introduced allowing the two nations' secret organizations to work together on a number of operations involving potentially dangerous anomalies. This meant that the SCP Foundation was finally able to step in and contribute to the GRU Division P's project concerning SCP-5001. Their first task? Actually getting inside the subterranean structure. Naturally, given how well-versed the Foundation is in dealing with anomalies, they had ideas for how to crack this nut. By acquiring anomalous technology from the Global Occult Coalition, another group of interest, as well as experimental designs created by one Dr. Elijah Rachma, the SCP Foundation were finally able to breach the structure in 1971. From then until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, the SCP Foundation and GRU Division P worked together to conduct a number of studies into the origin and purpose of SCP-5001. Both organizations were curious as to the technology the structure possessed, and attempts were even made to recreate some of the devices found within. Among this advanced technology were ontological stabilizers, also known as Scranton reality anchors, which are located around SCP-5001's inner chamber. These were designed to directly alter the amount of Humes in a given area. What's a Hume? Well, to keep it simple, a Hume is a measure of the reality around us. If it helps, imagine reality as a pile of sand. Now imagine that you remove a single grain of sand from the pile. Congratulations, you just removed one Hume from this reality. Taking one away doesn't really do much, but start grabbing handfuls and the pile gets smaller, scattered. Less a pile and more a light dusting of sand. Reality works the same way. Take too much away and it starts to lose whatever it was before. Being able to alter the amount of Humes in an area meant that these ontological stabilizers could alter the strength of reality itself, even nullify the reality-bending properties of some anomalies. In theory, an SCP with the power to influence reality could be contained using this technology. The effects of their abilities reduced significantly, although not negated entirely. Another noteworthy piece of technology uncovered was codenamed Omega. Omega was discovered in an unmarked room on a computer terminal that was connected to every area of SCP-5001 by dozens of cables. The software itself was an artificial intelligence construct, a computerized consciousness that seemed to serve the purpose of controlling the various systems within SCP-5001. The Omega seemed to work by providing an answer whenever someone used a keyboard to input a question. The artificial intelligence of Omega appeared able to hold a conversation, but would refuse to give any insight into when the SCP-5001 structure was built or what its purpose was. Despite neither group knowing what SCP-5001's function was, an agreement between the SCP Foundation and GRU Division P was formed. Both organizations shared the belief that Omega, the ontological stabilizers, as well as the other anomalous technologies could never, under any circumstances, be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. They had a pact to keep the knowledge of SCP-5001 and these devices strictly between themselves. However, this agreement was, sadly, not to last. In the early 90s, GRU Division P liquidated its assets and disbanded. A number of the Russian division's highest-ranking officers stole the anomalous technology that the organization had in its possession, which they then sold to Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited. MC&D Ltd are yet another of the SCP Foundation's groups of interest. According to Foundation intelligence, Marshall, Carter, and Dark Limited is a London-based club that has caused numerous problems for the Foundation over the years. They have ties to wealthy figures across the globe and cater to the super-rich clientele by providing them with the most exclusive, expensive, and rare experiences available. How do they do this? By gathering the anomalous items and auctioning them off to the highest bidders. A number of GRU Division P operatives also joined up with the Chaos Insurgency. This is a group of interest that consists of personnel who previously worked for the Foundation, but have since broken away to pursue their own rogue agenda. Much like a number of other groups of interest, the insurgency uses anomalies and SCPs for their own benefit, as well as dabbling in a bit of arms dealing and the selling of highly classified intelligence. Hey, it's good to have a diverse portfolio. Despite former members of GRU Division P seeking alternative employment with some less than reputable groups, the SCP Foundation still managed to keep the existence and location of SCP-5001 a closely guarded secret. However, even with the structure fully under their control, their leading researchers were still baffled as to what exactly the purpose of the underground structure was, or rather, that was the case. On December 30th, 2019, an explosion erupted in the northeast sector of SCP-5001. The cause of the explosion was unknown, but the damage caused a tremendous and almost catastrophic loss of power. Whether the explosion had been triggered by one of the many groups of interest, like the former GRU Division P, or just a machinery malfunction, it almost caused the total destruction of SCP-5001. What would be so bad about that? Well, remember earlier when we said that every so often an SCP comes along with its very own built-in method of containment? You see, it wasn't the structure or technology of SCP-5001 that the Foundation should have been worried about. It was the thing inside of SCP-5001. Just as some Foundation researchers had long theorized, SCP-5001 was a cage, a containment unit for its own anomalous objects within, something powerful enough to alter reality right down to the Humes, hence the need for ontological stabilizers to dampen its power, and Omega to keep the place running. This entity, known either as SCP-5001-A or the Devourer, was being held inside SCP-5001, and when the structure was damaged, it was almost freed. While there was no data on SCP-5001's computer system about this being's appearance or the extent of its anomalous powers, whoever created SCP-5001 went to considerable effort to keep the Devourer contained, viewing it as a threat to all of reality. And all that effort was almost undone when the structure was damaged by the explosion. Fortunately, the SCP Foundation was able to re-establish containment of SCP-5001-A, though at the cost of a tremendous amount of lives. When personnel were finally permitted to re-enter SCP-5001, a number of the structure's core systems had been damaged, but it was still able to perform its primary function and keep the Devourer safely contained within. As personnel entered the structure, a message appeared through the Omega computer system that read, "Hello, my children. Although you have grown immensely since your earliest days, you have much room to grow. Your species' intellect is merely a bud with so much potential. Your weapons are powerful. Your medicine is supreme. Your engineering is beautiful. With proper guidance and care, you are sure to reach an elevated state of being and transcend your bodies for something more whole and perfect. That is why it pains me so dearly to request that you leave this place immediately. Your studying and probing have almost resulted in the end of all I have worked towards to keep you alive. If you comply, I guarantee that the Devourer will never escape, and your species will be free to pursue the enlightenment of technology for all eternity. Let this be my final gift to you, directly from the center of my broken heart."
Okay, back up. Broken heart. Interesting. Where have we heard something like that before? We'd hate to jump to any conclusions, but when one hears about a being of great power related to large and mysterious machines, and that word again, broken,
All the groups of interest that seem to be tied into SCP-5001, and we'd neglected to mention perhaps the most important of all, the Church of the Broken God. This religious organization that reveres industry and technology over the impurity of flesh has been united in a singular purpose, rebuilding their deity, the broken god Mechane, whose body was split apart in an attempt to preserve the future of mankind. Perhaps the heart of this great and ancient machine, this devourer, is actually the heart of something else entirely. Though of course, there's only so much we can speculate. Knowledge, after all, can sometimes be like a flame. It can light your way, but if you get too close, you will inevitably be burned. If ever you're in doubt, ask the people devoured and assimilated by the heart of Mechane the last time it was freed by the Church. If ever the heart gets out again, you'll certainly be with them. The SCP Foundation has come so far. Their technology, their knowledge, their vast resources all allow them to contain some of the most powerful forces mankind has ever seen, and even some we haven't. But as SCP-5001 shows, there is still much that even the brightest researchers at the Foundation don't yet understand, and their drive to poke and prod at the unknown nearly led to the end of reality as we know it. Perhaps one day we'll be able to fully understand just what the Devourer is, and the ways that SCP-5001 worked to protect us from it, but we're not there yet, and there's no guarantee that we ever will be. While the pursuit of knowledge is always an admirable one, when it comes to SCP-5001, maybe the Foundation should have left well enough alone. It had been a long day. Expeditions like this were normally tiring, but with the intense heat of the Egyptian sun bearing down on them, every minute felt like hours, and every hour a lifetime. Seth and Kayla were determined not to quit. They had traveled halfway around the world to get to this site, and they weren't about to let the elements stop them from uncovering the secrets they were searching for. The rumors had dated back centuries. Stories of a hidden tomb lost somewhere out in the desert. And as a likely pair of budding adventurer and an accomplished archaeologist, neither one of them could resist the chance to try and hunt down the tomb. If they could uncover it, they'd have one of the greatest archaeological finds of the century on their hands. Both Kayla and Seth would forever be remembered as the ones who discovered a supposedly unfindable ancient tomb. Having found their way to some ruins, the remains of a temple that had been all but razed to the ground, ravaged by the forces of time, Kayla and Seth had started searching for the tomb's entrance. The reason it had stayed uncovered for so long was the amount of sand that had covered it over the centuries, storms from the desert constantly rearranging the grains and piling on more. But right now, the skies were clear, and all they could do was keep digging, until, at long last, their shovels struck stone. Clearing a path to the entrance, Kayla flipped on a torch as she led her archaeologist friend down a flight of stairs carved into the stone. Seth followed her as they traversed further and further down, the air getting stale the deeper they went. The whole while there was a gnawing concern at the back of both of their minds that the rocky ceiling above could give way at any moment, trapping them both underground. But before each of them could voice their worry out loud, they arrived at a large stone door, left wide open about 20 meters beneath the surface. "Is this really it?" Kayla asked in disbelief. "It might be," Seth replied, the excitement in his voice like that of a kid on Christmas morning. Standing before them, beyond the threshold of the open entrance, was a chamber of stone. Its ceiling was secure, about 7 meters high, and the walls had been covered in hieroglyphics. Immediately, Seth shot over to the nearest wall, pulling a battered journal out of his bag to start to try to translate what had been written. While he was doing that, Kayla's attention fell over the rest of the room. For a tomb, there was a surprising lack of a sarcophagus, nor any other similar resting place for a body, with no signs that anyone else had already been here to remove one either. All there really was within was a few bowls, randomly placed around the chamber. Kayla's torchlight fell over one of the bowls, and she knelt down to take a closer look at its contents. It was filled with bread. They were all holding different foods: dates, figs, dried fish, and lentils. Of course, it wasn't uncommon for offerings to be left with the deceased during an ancient Egyptian burial, but strangely, none of these perishable foods seemed to have decayed in the centuries this tomb had been lost for. In fact, It all looked quite fresh, like it was still good enough to eat. Although the temptation to actually eat any of it quickly disappeared when Kayla reminded herself that, while it might not look it, the food down here had to have been hundreds, maybe thousands of years old, despite how perfectly preserved it appeared. I think I've got something, Seth called enthusiastically. There's definitely a story in these hieroglyphics. You sure we're in the right place? Kayla asked as she crossed the room to where her colleague was. For a tomb, it doesn't seem like anyone was ever buried here. I've got a theory, he replied. This place might be more of a metaphorical tomb. Right, that makes complete sense. Her sarcasm was unmistakable. Look here, he said, pointing to one of the drawings on the wall as he spoke. It depicted a figure laying dead in a square space. I think that's meant to be this room. Someone dies here, and then Seth's finger moved to another of the hieroglyphics, one that Kayla recognized. It showed a being with the body of a man and the head of a jackal, taking the dead figure down into the afterlife. This was Anubis, one of the ancient Egyptian gods associated with the afterlife. According to legends and other texts gathered from the pyramids in Giza, Anubis oversaw the process the Egyptians would perform to embalm their dead, preserving them for their trip to the next world. Anubis takes whoever they are to the judgment hall of the afterlife to be brought before, Seth explained, only to be cut off. Osiris, god of fertility, the afterlife, and the dead, Kayla interrupted. She had already spotted the next being depicted in the glyphs, a tall figure with a distinctive headpiece, holding a symbolic crook and flail. Oversaw resurrection, life, probably many other things. Yeah, he was a god with a few different hats, Seth attempted to joke. Well, just the same one hat he's always shown wearing. Also, technically not a hat, the atif was a type of crown, and so, hold on, Kayla interjected again. Didn't Osiris only bring the pharaohs in for judgment? Who was this person that died? I mean, the Egyptians never went to this amount of trouble for their average Joes, and the gods wouldn't pay them any mind unless they were important somehow. I'm not sure, Seth answered earnestly. At any rate, this could all just be a myth. That's why I think this tomb is metaphorical. It wasn't built to house a dead person, but to keep people believing. She finished his sentence for him. He then pointed out the next part of the glyphs, the dead figure arriving in the afterlife, carried by Anubis for judgment, and then handing an object to Osiris. Seth explained there was a certain myth surrounding Osiris and his resurrection, a story that told of all of his dead body parts being found except one. Without it, the god could not be fully resurrected. My theory is that is Osiris's missing appendage, as it were. Seth's face was red as he tried to keep his composure. After our mysterious friend handed it over, the hieroglyphs showed the nameless dead figure being taken from Anubis's hand by Osiris, who then placed them back in the room they had started in, the same chamber Seth and Kayla were standing in. It seemed they had been resurrected after death. Giving Osiris something that the god had wanted had earned this figure a free pass back to the land of the living. The glyphs also showed bowls of food around the tomb, like the ones Kayla had found dotted around the room. There was a type of aura drawn around the unknown figure now, almost like a personal shield. According to the drawings and symbols on the walls and Seth's hastily translation of their meaning, this was some form of protection granted by Osiris himself. The aura was meant to prevent the figure from harm, meaning they couldn't die again. However, the next portion of the story showed Anubis damaging the shield, possibly out of jealousy or spite, or perhaps defying Osiris, tampering with the natural order of things by protecting the figure from death. As well as causing damage to the aura of immortality that Osiris had bestowed upon them, Anubis drained the figure of all of their blood, which then caused them to go and do the same to others. Seth continued interpreting aloud. It would find people, drink their blood to sustain it, like, don't say it, Kayla sighed. I mean, it's a lot like a Egypt gave us mummies. They can't have another native monster from horror B movies, she interrupted. Well, maybe the legend found its way here somehow, or at least a more ancient Egyptian version of it, her counterpart tried to reason. It looks like here the figure was far healthier after consuming blood. See how the aura around them is repaired now? But Seth, look at what they're standing on, Kayla whispered. One of the final images in the glyphs did display exactly what Seth had described, but beneath the feet of the figure, who now seemed replenished, was a mass of bodies, a pile of human corpses with one person standing at the very top. Who'd want to live forever anyway? Kayla muttered almost inaudibly. Hey, come and have a look at these. Leaning over, she picked up one of the food bowls from the floor, brimming with offerings of dates. She handed it to Seth, who marveled at how well preserved the food was. "That's incredible," he remarked. "This bowl looks like it's at least several thousand years old. I guess maybe 2500 BCE, but the dates..." He picked one out of the bowl and sniffed it, put it back, and then did the same with another, making sure it wasn't a fluke. The conditions couldn't possibly have kept them fresh. "So, how is it there are bowls of food all over this room that still look edible?" she asked. "I honestly have no..." he began to say, but the sound of heavy, grinding stone interrupted Seth's sentence. Both he and Kayla looked in horror as they witnessed the entrance of the tomb being sealed, the heavy stone door dropping moments away from sealing them in. "Seth, we need to run," Kayla urged, grabbing her bag. "If we move now, we can get out of here before we get shut in." "But..." Seth protested, looking around the tomb, the glyph walls that had only just been discovered. Nobody would know that he and Kayla had found them if they ran now. He looked around the room, pondering for a moment, his eyes darting from a bowl of bread to the bowl of dates in his hands. "We should at least take photos." "No time. Our lives aren't worth proving what we found. Better to make it out than be buried alive," Kayla shouted, darting towards the entrance, ducking under the slowly lowering stone door. "Seth, come on!" she called from the other side. Despite her calls for him to move, her fellow explorer didn't follow. He just stood there, watching the door get lower and the only way back to the surface get narrower. By the time it had completely closed, Kayla's voice sounded so much further away that Seth could barely make out what she was saying. "I'll get help! Find some way to get you out!" Kayla screamed at the wall, now separating her from the tomb. "If you can hear me, Seth, ration the water in your bag. Take small sips every few hours." Seth already knew that the human body could survive around 3 weeks on just water and no food, and he trusted Kayla would have figured out how to get him out by then. He gave another glance to the food bowls scattered throughout the tomb. The idea of eating any of it, knowing how old it all potentially was, did turn his stomach a little. But if it came down to having to eat just a bite in order to survive a little longer, Seth was sure it looked fresh enough to still be edible. It couldn't hurt to take a bite, right? Over the next few days, Seth's focus was spent entirely on photographing and transcribing more of the hieroglyphics, occasionally stopping to take swigs of water from his canteen. If anything, it was more to combat how warm and stuffy it was being locked inside the stone chamber 20 meters underground. Meanwhile, unseen to Seth, outside Kayla was working tirelessly to try and figure out a way to get the door open. She had been searching for days for any sign or some kind of switch or lever that would unseal the chamber entrance. There had to be some mechanism that had caused the stone door to shut itself in the first place, but there was nothing around that looked like it fit that description. As much as she urged Seth to abandon his archaeological finders keeper's pride, Kayla was hesitant to make the long journey back across the desert to Cairo to get help. Anyone she brought to the dig site might claim the discovery as their own, and more to the point, the more time she spent traveling across the desert for help, the more time Seth would spend trapped, succumbing to gradual dehydration and starvation. Little was Kayla aware. It was already too late. Seth hadn't been observing her warning about managing the amounts of water he was drinking, and pretty soon, his canteen was empty. He cursed himself, annoyed for being so involved in his discovery that he'd now potentially put his own life at risk. But then he remembered the food bowls. Kneeling down, he picked up the nearest one, the same bowl with all the dates in it. Shaking his head at the thought, he put them back down again. The longer he waited, the more Seth began to worry that maybe Kayla had abandoned him. And if she had, then he was faced with the inevitability that he would die down here, lost and forgotten in an ancient tomb underground. He couldn't help but find something ironic about the whole thing. He was going to die in a tomb whose walls told the tale of a dead person being brought back to life. Maybe in a few hundred years, more archaeologists would find this buried room and think he was the one the tomb had been constructed for. Even trying to put an ironic spin on things wasn't enough to give Seth much peace when staring down the possibility he might not see the sun and walk above ground again. And getting closer to death is what made him want to avoid it, tempting him towards the bowls of food. Every time he tried to remind himself not to touch any of it, the pain in his stomach swelled, even greater, reminding him of his own hunger. With no clear view of the sky, Seth had little clue just how many days he'd been trapped in the tomb, although he was sure it was approaching the day 4 threshold. He couldn't survive much longer beyond that point without eating. As the days dragged on, he abandoned his research and note-taking. It was impossible to focus on translating hieroglyphics when he was in so much pain, aching from the heat and having no food or water, exhaustion causing him to pass out. his body trying to conserve its already limited reserves of energy. Eventually, Seth started trying to rationalize eating at least a date or two. The food hadn't decomposed or rotted at all. Even introducing air from outside when the tomb was first opened hadn't changed the state of any of it at all. Not the dates, nor the bread, or the fish. It still looked fresh and edible, and after God knows how long without eating, it was beginning to look all the more appealing to the starving archaeologist. Who cares if it had been there for 1,000 years or longer? If Seth didn't eat, he knew he wouldn't last much longer. The moment he chewed on the first date, feeling it pass down his esophagus, passing from his mouth to his stomach, Seth immediately regretted giving in to his need to eat. His mouth instantly went dry, far worse than it had been after this long without water. It was like the tiny piece of fruit had pulled all the saliva from his mouth. Seth tried to scream in panic, only to release a hoarse, dry-throated grasp as he felt his tongue shriveling up with his mouth and throat until it felt like the skin of a drum. But it didn't stop there. It only got worse. Seth stared in horror at his own arms, the blue veins that ran underneath his skin rapidly draining away. His forearms and biceps shrunk, muscle and sinew shriveling like his body had been left in a water evaporator. All the while, the pain of having his entire physical form being reshaped was pure agony. The dehydration of his mouth meant Seth still couldn't scream, only dropped to the ground as he felt the same thing happening to his legs. Every drop of moisture in his body, every fluid from water to blood, saliva, and even urine was drying out, leaving Seth as little more than a dusty, desiccated husk. Before his own eyes, he could only watch as his skin lost its pigment, drying into a thin, leathery texture, drained of its original color as his blood stopped flowing. Outside, Kayla had been coming back to the tomb's sealed door every day and would stay until the late hours of the evening. She tried digging down from the surface to reach the chamber where Seth had been trapped, but it was too far underground. There was no sign of any way to move or reopen the stone door. That is, until she heard the heavy grinding of it opening on its own. Kayla raced down the steps towards the tomb. It had been 5 whole days since she and Seth got separated, and he'd need food and medical attention. Sprinting into the dark tunnel, she arrived just in time to see the entrance reopening, expecting to see Seth standing on the other side as the stone door lifted. What she saw instead was a nightmare. It looked like a corpse, an ancient and decomposing dead body. Kayla had seen plenty entombed in sarcophagi on her many travels exploring ancient ruins around the world, but she had never seen one standing up. It was still breathing, a wheezing, raspy sound escaping its mouth. Its skin looked almost brittle, as if it was stretched too thin, almost see-through enough to show off the bones underneath. The upright corpse's face was all wrong, too. Sunken cheeks and eye sockets deeper than they should have been. It looked so different that it wasn't until Kayla shone her flashlight on its drained face that she recognized who it was. Seth. He lunged at her immediately, racing towards her, snarling with his dry, desiccated mouth. Kayla turned and ran as he came after her, bony fingers swiping at her clothes. Her flashlight gripped in her hand was all but useless as she sprinted back the way she'd come, swinging back and forth in her arm, barely illuminating much of the cavern that led to the tomb. The whole while she was running from it, she could hear the wheezing behind of Seth behind her, terrified of whatever he had become and why he was chasing her. Then she saw it, the stairs, her one shot at getting out and getting away. If she could make it to the surface, she could put some more distance between herself and the drained, dehydrated corpse. All she had to do was make it up. The last step. She had just made it when she felt the shriveling hand grip her ankle, tripping her over. Falling face first in the sand, Kayla scrabbled at the loose grains, trying to pull herself away as her body was dragged back down onto the stone stairs. She felt a searing pain and screamed into the empty desert as the corpse's fingers dug into her neck, its leathery dry skin against hers. Eventually, the screaming stopped, replaced with a dry, hoarse gasping, and then silence, as Seth drained her body of her blood along with the rest. Pulling Kayla's body by her ankle, Seth dragged whatever was left of her back down towards the tomb, SCP-3359, to feed on what was left.
Qinghai Lake. The largest lake in China is one of the most secure locations the SCP Foundation has ever taken control of. All available military assets have been gathered at the site, including 3 of the most elite mobile task force units with experimental weaponry. SCP-4290 must not be allowed to open. and the site has been surrounded by nuclear mines and targeted with the Dagaz-Break orbital strike system. The perimeter cannot be breached, even if it means the complete annihilation of the entire area. This is considered to be an acceptable loss for the Foundation, since the destruction that would be caused by taking such an extreme measure is far from the worst-case scenario when it comes to SCP-4290. That's because the entity contained within SCP-4290's site has the potential to create a true end-of-the-world scenario. The Foundation, of course, is no stranger to such situations, and even has a set of designations for the various types of apocalypses, like CK-class restructuring scenarios and ZK-class end-of-reality scenarios. And since dealing with the end of the world is nothing new for the Foundation, certain precautions have been taken at the 4290 site. If containment measures fail, selected Foundation personnel and civilians will be taken into nearby emergency shelters that will hopefully survive the chaos that would occur following a breach. And the Foundation assumed that there was a good chance this plan would have to be used at some point, since at the time these precautions were put in place, it was impossible to know the chance of successful long-term containment. But just what is the entity that is held within the site of SCP-4290 that is capable of causing so much death and destruction on a major scale? They call it simply the Child. No one has ever seen the Child. No one knows what the entity is. That's because even setting aside all the Foundation's security, the site itself is still deeply protected. Literally. Over 100 feet below the surface of Qinghai Lake, a stunning collection of relics can be found. The site is thaumaturgically sealed with 8 massive metal totems made of beryllium and bronze that resemble armed warriors. The statues are inscribed with runes and arranged in a pattern designed to banish the entity kept there and keep the seal on its prison closed. Archaeological evidence indicates that the site has been there for a very long time, and it is still active, with the center of the site periodically emitting bursts of red light, but lately the bursts have suddenly started getting brighter. You may be wondering how we know so much about SCP-4290, and that it's a site designed to keep something sealed if it's been deep in a lake quietly doing its job. The SCP Foundation has access to unusual sources, including SCP-1726, and it's from there that we learned the little we know about SCP-4290. SCP-1726 is a library in China that appears to only be 1 floor from the outside, but on the inside covers over 14 square kilometers in area. It's full of a seemingly limitless amount of texts, many of which describe ancient and lost civilizations, along with some clues as to what led to the fall of these cultures. One text reveals the presence of a terrible and apparently unstoppable enemy. It was called the Child, but it was anything but innocent. When these texts were translated, what Foundation researchers discovered terrified them. They described the emergence of a beast with 10 terrible mouths and 20 arms stretched wide. It was attacked by an army of warriors, but they were quickly overwhelmed by what was described as torrents of darkness and dead geometries. They were killed brutally, and the Child used its skeletal fingers to unleash a torrent of flame. Every soul in the vicinity was consumed. Wax rained from the sky, and the Child devoured everything around it for 10 days, as the whole world trembled. But then something sealed the Child away in its prison, which is now covered by the waters of Qinghai Lake. Soon, ominous signs began to appear that the Child would awaken again, though. One day, televisions in the nearby area all suddenly stopped playing their regular programming and began to show images of SCP-4290, with a mysterious voice coming on over the images saying, "Repair the Child's locks." This became more and more frequent, and the tone of the voice became more worried, eventually saying, "There is little time left." Further investigations of the location revealed the location of the mysterious mechanism that kept the chamber sealed, which was designated as SCP-4290 lock. But how do you repair a device that is eons old? And should you even be fixing it when the one telling you to do so is a mysterious disembodied voice that only appears on pirated television broadcasts? The Foundation scrambled to find any information they could, and they were able to find clues about the history of SCP-4290 referenced in other texts. Lost civilizations like the Xia Dynasty, the Erkshans, and the ancient Orthonians had apparently strengthened the seals during their own reigns. But the most significant findings indicated a connection to one of the most terrifying entities the SCP Foundation had ever contained, and one of the most unpredictable, the Davit Empire. This mysterious warlike civilization has only been known through one source, SCP-140, a single hard-copy book titled A Chronicle of Devas. This is a strange, anomalous book that is written in blood and is able to add more pages spontaneously to itself whenever it comes in contact with any fluid that can be used for writing, but seems to especially prefer human blood. It recounts the history of this civilization and their many brutal conquests. While there was no proof of the Devas before the book was found, evidence paralleling the events written in the book is now being found in archaeological digs. More dangerously, as more pages appear in the book, the events of the Deva Empire are moving closer to present day, with them currently appearing in the book as having existed until 270 CE. The Devas were a bloodthirsty, brutal race of warriors. But there was one thing even they were afraid of: the child. The Devas had performed the last successful ritual of sacrifice needed to strengthen the lock not long before their currently described destruction, and the book contained enough detail to recreate the ritual. But SCP researchers would find that performing it would not be for the faint of heart. The ritual required 3 human cadavers, not a problem for an organization that's normal day-to-day operation results in the loss of multiple lives, and the live heart of an angel. The description of the ritual said that the materials would be presented, new runes should be carved into the totems. The items would then vanish when the ritual was completed, and the lock would somehow be renewed by this. It wasn't much to go on, but time was running out. The Foundation's Department of Occult Containment quickly sprang into action, assembling the materials and placing them in the correct formation. While it was not safe to descend that deep underwater to perform the ritual manually, technology could fill the role. A fleet of remotely operated submersibles equipped with carving material would carry the materials and perform the ritual without any human hands needed. One of the red bursts occurred midway through the ritual, causing radiation damage to the vehicles. Runes that have been carved in the past were also damaged, and the ritual was interrupted. While it seemed like it might have been enough to activate the site, it wasn't perfect. And when the ritual was complete, one of the 3 cadavers and half of the angel heart were still present at the site. Had it been enough to satisfy the ritual and reseal the lock, there was nothing to do but wait and see. They wouldn't have to wait long for their answer, as the mysterious voice once again took over the televisions in the area. This time, its message was less friendly. The sacrifice did not reach the 10 maws. Brace. The child apparently was not satisfied, and the lock was not sealed. Everyone feared it was too late to prevent what was coming, and panic was starting to spread among the ranks. One day, several personnel stationed at the Qinghai Lake site broke protocol and fled. None of them were ever found, but one fugitive staff member, an Agent Zenobia Marinos, left behind a note though. It read, "Do we think we can actually stop this? No civilization before us wanted to fight the child. None of them. The sacrifices won't work anymore. It refuses to consume them. They aren't enough to satiate it. Once the seal breaks, we'll have a world of molten darkness and the child will be all that's left. Eating, drinking, you're fools for staying." Agent Marinos was apparently so scared that she had fled through a portal to an extra-dimensional space in order to escape. There would be no point in trying to track her, even if she was still alive. But in our own dimension, time was running out. Foundation seismologists were brought to the site and stationed outside, and began monitoring the high-energy pulses coming from behind the lock. The energy was reportedly strong enough to alter dimensions, and the pulsing red light now covered the entire sealing site, growing stronger and stronger as the totems started degrading at an alarming rate. The Foundation stood on guard for whatever was about to emerge, but no one knew if they had any chance against whatever it was. On August 18th, the totems fully disintegrated. Some of the Foundation's best military forces gathered on the shores of the lake and waited. 10 minutes later, something massive emerged phase out of the lock and onto the seabed, and didn't move. The assembled Foundation forces were confused and continued to observe the creature, and after no activity was seen after 3 hours, the authorization was given for submersibles and a small exploratory team to proceed down to the seabed for an up-close investigation. There, down on the floor of the lake, was the child. It was as terrifying as described, with a countless mouths and arms and huge in size, over 40 meters long. The signs of previous rituals were everywhere, with angel hearts and human corpses littered around, some in the creature's mouth, but none of them had been eaten. The ritual had apparently been performed many times, but to no actual purpose. The massive being was scanned many times, but no sign of psychic energy, radiation, or other life signs were detected. The child was dead, and it had apparently been so for a very, very long time. Once the area had been cleared, teams were brought in to investigate the body in person and perform an autopsy on site. No explanation of what exactly this creature had been or what its origins were has ever been discovered, but they did get answers for when it died. The time of death was roughly 9,000 years ago, not long after its initial sealing. The cause of death was discovered too. The child destroyer of worlds and scourge of countless civilizations had died from malnutrition. Whatever this thing had been, it had been sealed away and had died from hunger not long after. One civilization after another had continued to perform the rituals to keep it sealed, never aware that it was no longer a threat. With this new discovery, SCP-4290 was reclassified as neutralized, but the child taught us all a valuable lesson about being prepared for potential world-ending scenarios. And the Foundation continues to stand on alert for any more entities from the distant past that may pose a threat today. Because who knows what else is sealed away at the bottom of a lake, abandoned mine, or in the ocean's deepest trenches. There might just be another existential threat to humanity that's just waiting for a chance to emerge and help us all if it remembered to pack a lunch.
There's a quote that says, "The beautiful thing about learning is nobody can take it away from you. But what good is learning if the knowledge might hurt you, drive you mad, or even kill you? It just sits there in your mind, like a stick of dynamite with an invisible fuse. It could blow at any moment. All it takes is a careless slip of the tongue, and you might turn into a talking home appliance." This is a conundrum faced by anyone dealing with an Infohazard, a certain kind of anomaly often dealt with by the SCP Foundation. Before we get into some of the craziest examples of Infohazards and what they've done to people, because let's face it, that's what you're really here for. First, we have to answer that big question everyone's a little afraid to ask. Just what is an Infohazard? And how does it differ from a far more common type of SCP, the dreaded cognitohazard? Well, we're glad you're finally brave enough to ask. First, cognitohazards are anomalies that are dangerous to perceive through one of the senses. A well-known example is SCP-096, which is actually a visual cognitohazard. You see its face and you're toast. It's as simple as that. And cognitohazards exist for all of the other senses too: hearing, taste, touch, even smell. Infohazards, on the other hand, are different. These anomalous effects are triggered when you start trying to express or describe something about what you've perceived. And when you do, things start to get really weird, really fast. Maybe you're trying to explain what you just saw to family members, friends, or the police. Maybe you're a member of SCP Foundation staff trying to write up a report or a new experiment log. Or maybe you're a YouTube channel trying to create entertaining yet informative breakdowns and explanations of anomalies from the SCP Foundation. If any or all of these apply to you, then Infohazards are going to be your worst enemy. But as we look at some of the strangest examples, we'll try our best to resist their effects. First, seeing as it's so hot out, how about we take a relaxing dip in the pool while we tell you all about SCP-1128. What is SCP-1128? Well, that's a loaded question. Technically speaking, it's a massive predatory aquatic creature. But despite its huge size, the creature can hunt its prey in any body of water. Whether you're stepping in a puddle, relaxing in the bath, or say chilling out in the pool, SCP-1128 can track you down and potentially eat you alive. In one particularly horrifying test, a D-Class was drinking from a simple glass of water when the aquatic predator emerged, yanked them inside, and ate them. Okay, so maybe you're feeling a little nervous now, but don't worry, you're still safe. Some people have even survived their attacks from SCP-1128. Well, their initial attacks anyway. The creature has a tendency to come back again and again, relentless in its ravenous hunger for human flesh. Whenever it attacks successfully, all that's left is some blood floating on the water. But again, please don't worry too much about this creature. We don't have another 682 on our hands. After all, it's an Infohazard. It can only start hunting you if you receive a written or verbal description of the creature. Oh, or some kind of visual representation of the creature too. Actually, on second thought, you might want to get out of the pool. Now. And put down that drink too. Instead, let us tell you a nice little story. You step into a bar, smelling of fine liquor and rich mahogany. You even get a whiff of some fine leather-bound book. You see us sitting at the bar, motioning for you to come over, and you decide to approach. You're intrigued by our winning smile and our vast knowledge of anomalies and SCP Foundation lore. You take a seat next to us and order a drink. Get something fancy. It's on our tab after all. Our treat. What does this have to do with Infohazards, you ask? That's the thing about SCP-1893, kid, we say, our dulcet tones smoother than scotch. You can never just talk about it. It's an Infohazard that forces information about it to be delivered like a story. That's why we're in this bar right now. That's the setup. It expresses actual information about itself through the dialogue, see? You nod, beginning to grasp the concept as the bartender serves you your drink. It's been forever since you've been to a bar. Feels good to be out again, honestly. You drink deeply, savoring the flavor, but you almost choke when you see the man standing in the corner. He's so large and so distinctive, it surprises you that you hadn't noticed him before now. He stands in the corner, a freakishly tall and muscular guy, like a basketball player who decided to become a pro bodybuilder. His muscular arms are bulging out of his white vest, and a pair of bull's horns are tattooed across the top of his bald head, making him look like the devil made flesh. He stares at you with a subdued kind of annoyance, as if to say that you're not in real danger quite yet, but if he wanted, he could grab you and twist your head off like a bottle cap. What's with the huge guy, you ask us, more than a little concern in your voice? Oh, him? We reply with a smirk. He comes with the anomaly. He appears in every SCP-1893 experience to an extent, though his level of involvement varies. If SCP-1893 doesn't perceive you as an annoyance or a threat, then you're good to go. But if 1893 starts to feel like you're gonna cause it some problems, then the guy with the horn tattoos is gonna intervene. Speaking of which, you look up and you see that the giant man is now standing next to you, brow furrowed in visible rage. He picks up your drink and crushes the glass in his hand without flinching, dripping booze and blood onto the counter. He snarls, "I think you've had enough, buddy. Now it's time for you to leave, or we're gonna have to get physical. Capiche?" You don't need to be told twice. You grab your hat, get up and leave the bar, abandoning us on our lonely stool. But our next Infohazard still awaits.
You like poetry? Japanese poetry, yes? The humble haiku. It's Dear 931, a unique Infohazard. It's so poetic.
Though specifically it takes the form of haiku. So what does that mean? A rigid structure. The first line 5 syllables, then 7, then 5. We can't talk about this in ways other than haiku. It is challenging. Object class is safe. It is kept at Site 19. Need 3rd tier clearance. So what is this thing? SCP-931. It is a rice bowl, white with a blue band and a cracked blue pattern, all inside the bowl. And we must confess, we took that one from the file. Man, haikus are hard. 3 inches in height, 4.5 inches across. Metric doesn't fit. No maker's marks found. Suspected to have been made late 1900s. Really makes you think on the skill of these poets. Sans anomalies. Sure, it can't kill you, but writing these drives you mad. Curse 931. Trapped in this rhythm scheme makes the old man's torture world look like a resort. Okay, let's move on. Other SCPs to see. We're sick of haiku. Okay, back to normal. Time to shake off the structures of SCP-931 and talk about another iconic Infohazard, SCP-3007. This incurable info hazard is a lot less whimsical than a rice bowl that forces you to write and speak in haiku. In fact, it's literally killed 7 people, and some in surprisingly gruesome ways. The main component of the info hazard is known as SCP-3007-1. This is an extremely vivid anomalous hallucination that affects those under the 3007 umbrella, known as SCP-3007-2. To be afflicted with SCP-3007 is a truly horrifying and debilitating condition. The hallucinations occur at an average of 4 times a day, with each episode lasting for as long as an hour. And during these episodes, the victims are at risk of grievous bodily harm, or even death. So the question now is, what exactly is the SCP-3007-1 hallucination? To the people experiencing it, they appear to be transported to a strange alien world consisting of a huge number of white towers or pillars stretching into the sky. SCP-3007-2 specimens are trapped on a series of bridges, incredibly far off the ground, that connect these various structures. This anomalous area is known as SCP-3007-3. It is important to remember that people transported to this world still remain, physically, in our own. However, any damage sustained with SCP-3007-3 will carry over into our own reality. To give one particularly gruesome example, some people fall from the precarious bridges and tumble to their deaths in SCP-3007-3. Back in our reality, they suddenly explode from the damage of an invisible high-speed impact, killing them instantly. There's much more to SCP-3007, enough that it probably warrants its own explanation, and the SCP Foundation takes it extremely seriously, believing that if the info hazard is allowed to breach containment and become contagious, it could result in an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario. As a result, anyone found to be infected by SCP-3007 is contained and summarily terminated to reduce the risk of its spreading. To make things even worse, there are also concerns about SCP-3007-3 seeping into our reality, as those standing within a 2-meter range of SCP-3007-2 during a 3007-1 episode can actually hear the sounds from the terrifying hallucinatory reality. Okay, that was a little scary. How about instead of falling to your death without falling at all, we talk about a nice movie? Gonarshrav by Martin Scorsese, one of the best gangster movies of all time. Wait, you've never heard of Gonarshrav? It's got everything. Action, suspense, romance, a mountain of black thorns on which lives a dark tyrant of terrible and unknowable power. You sure you've never seen Gonarshrav? Well, here's the thing. All signs point to movies like Gonarshrav's and many others simply not existing. This comes as a result of SCP-2747, an infohazardous phenomenon that causes people to talk about works of fiction that don't exist. These works often feature commonalities, like an ethereal or disturbing tone, ambiguity, black thorns, and a sinister, mysterious antagonist. The Foundation is doing all they can to hunt down and suppress SCP-2747, but it's proving more difficult than they'd imagined. Currently, the leading hypothesis is that these tales may have actually existed once, but were erased from reality, leaving only the residue of memory and the odd scrap of evidence around. Many researchers speculate that the various pieces that form SCP-2747 are anafabula, pieces of fiction accidentally composed with the perfect elements to cause them to quite literally erase themselves over time. Now, the greatest concern that the Foundation has about these anafabulas is that they might actually be one, and their reality is on the precipice of collapse. But we really don't have time to unpack that right now. And like SCP-3007, a full explanation of this anomaly would take some time and is probably best tackled on its own. But there you have it, folks, info hazards. They all say that knowing is half the battle, but in this case, it is the whole battle, and if you know, you lose. Not really a battle at all, come to think of it. More of a trap. But whether it's a vicious megafish, a strangely buff man with bull tattoos, a poetic rice bowl, or a nightmarish ordeal of daily hallucinations, there is no doubt that info hazards are some of the most strange and fascinating anomalies that the Foundation has to offer.
Oh, and of course, how could we forget the most well-known info hazard of all, SCP-2521. This entity is so info-hazardous that its Foundation file entry is written in pictograms. This is because whenever information is recorded about this entity, it manifests and steals it. If you write it down, it'll take the paper.
If you make a note of it on a computer, it'll take the computer. And of course, if you talk about it, it'll... Oh no, 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 I can't, no, 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 no! Ah! Oh, that was a close one. But I'm okay. For now, at least. But don't worry about me. Working at the SCP Foundation might just be the most exciting job a person can ask for. And by exciting, we mean that if you work as an SCP field operative, researcher, or mobile task force member, you're much more likely to die a horrific death on the job than, say, a plumber. But at least you get the honor of proudly saying that you're the first line of defense between the normal world and the terrifying domain of the anomalous. Well, unless you're one of the IT guys. Then your work life is likely as tedious and uneventful as the computer tech guy working on the Geek Squad. But nothing is ever normal when it comes to the SCP Foundation, where even the person whose job is helping other staff members reset their email passwords may run into the supernatural. Welcome to the strange and frightening world of pattern screamers, and specifically, SCP-000. SCP-000 was first discovered completely on accident by technical researcher David Rosen, a man intrinsically connected to the pattern screamers lurking on the SCP Foundation computer database. Technical researcher Rosen is actually somewhat of a celebrity around the Foundation staff, due to the fact that he's so perfectly mediocre at what he does. His job as the glorified IT guy at the SCP Foundation was previously held by the more qualified researcher Patrick Gephardt, but Rosen was called in to replace him after Gephardt mysteriously disappeared while on the job. Since 2012, Rosen has been Site-19's user-level tech support wizard, but the best thing that can really be said about his job competency is that he's got a 100% attendance record. He seems to live out of his office, which is described as the filthiest at the whole Foundation. Every inch of the floor is covered in old, broken computer parts, and the air is stale with dust and the twin odors of sweat and lithium grease. It's a place so inhospitable that the Foundation has seriously considered bottling the stench as a kind of chemical deterrent. While Technical Director Rosen isn't good at his job per se, he isn't technically bad enough at it to justify the time and resources it would take to replace him. But the worst part about Rosen isn't his performance, it's his truly rotten attitude. He's universally described by his colleagues as being rude, grumpy, and combative, with patience that's far too short for someone working in tech support. And while Rosen does have a real fear that the ghost of researcher Gephardt is stalking him, he was about to have his first actual brush with the supernatural. It all started when he began receiving automated repair tickets for SCP-000, a file that had no reason to exist. As any longtime follower of the SCP Foundation will know, the universal designation for the first cluster of SCPs to be discovered is SCP-001. There is no SCP-000. It simply doesn't exist. And when Rosen first found the file lurking on the database, he found that it was filled with worthless nonsense. The object class was recorded as null. The special containment procedures read, error, field containment_procedures does not exist. And the mess of a description simply read, internal system error, field undefined. Please contact system administrator over and over again, becoming more mangled and nonsensical each time. Technical Director Rosen, who could never resist an opportunity to complain, decided to leave an angry administrator's note on the useless file. He claimed that this pile of junk data was sending out pointless repair tickets because of its broken syntax, clogging up the system and preventing him from doing actual work on meaningful files. He assumed that this was all down to the database not knowing how to react to having files logged with insufficient information, and he suppressed all future repair tickets from SCP-000 before declaring the matter over and done with. What the pig-headed technical director didn't realize was that he was suppressing a call for help from an entity trapped in the white space below the article itself. It was a being born into a pure white world of absolute nothingness, an entity with no name and no place, but it was somehow capable of thought. Its panicked inner monologue is readable in the hidden text, which takes the form of a rambling stream of consciousness.
The being first described coming to life in this empty world with no memories of where it was or even how it got there. It spent what could have been years exploring the empty wasteland. Occasionally, it would see horrific monsters pop up around it, but only for a split second. The entity continued to wander, and little by little, the existential dread mounted as it realized that it may truly be stuck here in oblivion forever. The entity only had one word to go on, a word repeated by some of the monsters it encountered: Foundation. The entity had no idea what this foundation even was, but it grew to hate and fear it. Was this foundation the one that trapped it here? The entity had all the time in the world to speculate on it. Eventually, the entity found its voice. Like any sentient creature in trouble, it began to call for help, eventually screaming, just hoping someone would notice it. These pleas likely translated into the frequent IT repair tickets, a coded SOS, an attempt to show that everything was not as it appeared on the SCP-000 file. Perhaps the entity may have found help if researcher Gephardt was still working at the Foundation, but instead its cries fell on the ignorant ears of Technical Director Rosen. It may as well have been speaking to a brick wall. Rosen, who had all the investigative zeal of Paul Blart Mall Cop, made sure that these cries would never lead to the entity's freedom when he suppressed the repair tickets. He had trapped the entity in a private blank hell, forever hating a life it didn't choose and could never escape. A relentless, existential nightmare. This is the gist of your average pattern screamer. Pattern screamers are a perfect example of literally making something out of nothing. They are often a kind of floating consciousness, created from nothing, trapped in pockets of nothingness between the fabric of reality, driven mad by the purgatory-like nature of their existence. They're less living entities and more conceptual constructs, pure ideas, that just happen to be self-aware of their own existence in their private hellish voids. The SCP-00 file, a file for an anomaly that doesn't exist and thus had no reason to exist, is a perfect breeding ground for a pattern screamer. But sadly for the pattern screamer in question, Technical Director Rosen had no idea. This isn't the only time that Rosen had run into a pattern screamer without even knowing either. And just like the first case, he was with no help whatsoever. This one began with SCP-S, an otherwise empty file containing only this image. Director Winters, a Foundation administrator, wondered why this file even existed. Enter Technical Director Rosen, filled with equal parts sarcasm and insubordination. He gave a condescending reply to Director Winters, saying that the file was there to test the filing system, and the image was likely just a placeholder. Winters never should have been on the page anyway, according to Rosen. Director Winters was annoyed at Rosen's typically rude tone and asked him to make the purpose of the article clearer in the article itself. In response, Rosen did as he was told, filling the article in the most sarcastic manner possible. The whole thing was essentially a middle finger to Director Winters for having the audacity to even ask. Rosen signed off with, "There, finished. I certainly hope I have been clear enough to anyone who may have accidentally accessed this page, through what I am sure is no fault of their own, so we won't have any more incredibly competent directors bugging the tech team about this page." And once again, technical researcher Rosen was too busy being a rude, unpleasant jerk to notice he was practically staring another pattern screamer in the face. This pattern screamer, or rather hive of pattern screamers, were trapped even deeper than the one in SCP-000. This one was hidden in the very source code of SCP-S, where a chorus of enraged voices screamed the following: "Pretend, monster, just for a minute. Pretend you were the size of an amoeba, dwarfed by even the smallest of bugs. Pretend you didn't hold the world in a glass cage. Pretend you were the one being held by something greater than yourself. Would you still be laughing at your triumphs? Would you still feel pride in what you were, even as pitifully small as you would be? Of course you would, because you are arrogant and stupid. If you haven't guessed yet, we hate you." This pattern screamer is clearly more aware of its pitiful station in existence than the 000 pattern screamer, and as a result, it's not so much depressed as it is furious. Though at this point, you've probably figured out that even the entities who have the most casual brushes with technical researcher Rosen end up getting infuriated. But while you may have gotten the impression that all pattern screamers are sad little entities worthy of our sympathy and pity, there's at least one pattern screamer that's actually incredibly dangerous. This is SCP-3930, the ultimate pattern screamer, in terms of both size and effect. It's an anomaly so strange it defies typical containment classification, and it bears a level 5 security lock, meaning only those on the level of the legendary O5 Council are cleared to even know about it. Its greatest containment procedure is the preservation of the very idea that SCP-3930 does not exist, because the alternative has terrifying implications for all involved. SCP-3930 is a 1-kilometer area in Russia that is filled with non-existence. To even call it a white void would be inaccurate, because it implies the existence of the color white and the existence of the concept of a void. Nothing exists within SCP-3930, and anyone who directly observes 3930 runs the risk of actively increasing its power. That's why special containment procedures dictate that anyone who observes 3930 must be forced to walk into it afterwards, which results in them ceasing to exist. They're destroyed on the deepest level that anything can be destroyed. The very idea of them ceases to be. Another reason that SCP-3930 is so special is that because it's the largest area of nothing in existence interacting directly with our reality, it's the only place that a huge number of pattern screamers can be directly observed by humans. They're described as being like sentient hallucinations. One researcher suggests that these pattern screamers are created by the way the psyche shatters when brought into contact with raw, true nothingness. The nothingness acts like a hateful mirror to our worst thoughts, reflecting them back at us in the forms of restless screamers. Regardless of what they actually are, one thing is for sure. Coming into direct contact with one of these screamers is a harrowing experience. In the end, it just goes to show that pattern screamers are a complex entity. They can range from microscopic to massive, from pitiful to downright terrifying. And the sad result is that, in either case, nothing can really be done to stop them. It's just as impossible to stop the nothingness existing in SCP-3930 as it is to save the entity trapped in the white spaces of SCP-000. Maybe the best option is to actually be more like Technical Director Rosen. Keep your head down, focus instead on your own petty worries, and bask in the warm bliss that can only come with having no idea what you're dealing with. The one downside is that this may make you a pretty lousy IT guy.
I would like to here again state that 106 is not, as is commonly believed, a basic predator, on par with an advanced shark. SCP-106 is a sentient being, albeit a totally alien one. SCP-106 appears to be aware of several things beyond the scope of pure instinct and genetic memory. SCP-106 consistently breaches at moments where recovery and containment are most difficult. A fox may see his way out of a trap, but only a man will wait for his captors to look away to escape.
Dr. Alok from his paper on sentience in contained humanoids. They say that patience is a virtue. If this is true, it's the only virtue that SCP-106 has in spades. The anomaly known as the Old Man had been well behaved for months, sitting cross-legged in the center of his containment chamber, his lipless mouth molded into a slight grin. The Old Man had a reptilian-like calm to him, never truly inactive, just waiting. And nobody else can wait for quite as long as him. He could go for years without so much as twitching if he wanted to. But not today. Today was special. There were no clocks and no calendars in SCP-106's cell. But that was fine. He remembered the last day they locked him back up, and he'd been counting ever since. Seconds, minutes, days, months. The Old Man had all the time in the world. And today, it was all about to pay off. October 31st, All Hallows Eve, the night when ghosts, goblins, and demons come out to play. The Old Man almost chuckled at the thought of it. What a perfect day for a containment breach. One of the Foundation technicians observing 106 from a control room monitor spilled his coffee when the Old Man got up and started walking towards the wall.
Alarms went off and guards were dispatched as a large dark stain expanded on the wall of the containment chamber and 106 walked through it. Not that any amount of armed response would do them any good. The bullets passed right through 106's inky flesh as he strolled down the corridor towards the exit. He killed 2 guards and a researcher on his way out, just for the fun of it. He'd been a well-behaved creature for a long time now. He'd earned an evening of letting his purely metaphorical hair down. And when 106 decides to have a night of good fun, horror is always sure to follow. This is the tale of one of SCP-106's most infamous and horrifying containment breaches. Be warned, the following isn't for the faint of heart. You're about to learn why SCP-106 is still one of the most feared anomalies in Foundation containment. Immediately, the containment site dispatched 3 of its best field agents, Agent Park, Agent Wang, and Agent Drack. Their task was simple: locate SCP-106, minimize potential casualties, and distract the sadistic anomaly long enough for reinforcements to come and contain the creature once again. For the last several years, these agents would eat, sleep, and breathe all things 106 in preparation for a moment just like this. They'd been drilled over and over again on everything from the creature's behavior to the worst-case scenario of what to do if you get pulled into its nightmarish pocket dimension. They were as trained as a person possibly could be for this situation, and fitted with state-of-the-art Foundation equipment to boot. And yet, they were still terrified. They passed through the streets of the nearest city, where containment experts believed 106 was most likely to head after his escape. People of all ages, dressed in Halloween costumes, were out enjoying the night. Child-sized superheroes were hanging out with even smaller villains. Horror movie slashers were sharing drinks with cops and nuns. Countless candy-carrying zombies wandered through the streets. None of them had any idea of the true horror that walked among them. The 3 agents went over their training silently in their minds. 106 was intelligent, more intelligent than anyone back at the Foundation really gave it credit for. It had planned this. It knew that it could blend in among the costume monsters that were sure to be out tonight. Nobody would be able to tell the difference until it was too late. One such person was a young woman named Alice. Dressed up as an angel, her experience that night would be far from heaven sent. Her boyfriend had made the always classy move of breaking up with her right before they were supposed to head to a Halloween party, leaving her in a fit of emotional distress and embarrassment. Over the course of the next several hours, she obsessively reflected on her ex-boyfriend's audacity and lack of empathy towards her, burdening her mind and filling her head with anxiety. His last words, "I'm sorry, it's over," gradually became louder and louder in her thoughts as she stumbled in sadness away from the noise of the streets towards a thicket of trees. She was in such despair she could barely stand, and as she staggered through the vegetation, she didn't even notice the shuffling of footsteps behind her, or that they were getting closer and closer and closer. Alice tripped and caught herself against a nearby tree. That's when she noticed a sudden burning sensation on the skin of her hand. She looked up and saw that her hand was now coated in a sticky tar-like substance. Whatever it was, it seemed to be eating away at the tree, and she could hear the hiss of the corrosive liquid as it melted the skin of her hand. A twig cracked beneath her, and she turned to see the rotting old man staring at her with a malicious grin. She screamed and began to run, but the alcohol had robbed her of her coordination. She tried as hard as she could to escape while cradling her burning hand, but it wasn't enough. She felt a spike of excruciating pain rock her nervous system. The old man had reached into her back like a man operating a puppet. His long, burning fingers, dripping with corrosive grease, had melted through her skin and grabbed her by the spine. She screamed in pain, but she was too far away. Not a soul could hear her, and the only creature that could didn't have anything resembling a soul. The creature grabbed her and pulled her into its blistering embrace. It smiled the whole time, baring every rotten tooth. It held her in place, burning the rest of her body as the two of them sank into the ground together, more acidic sludge pooling at their feet. Alice screamed on, and SCP-106 loved her all the more for it.
The screamers were its favorite. By the time Agent Drack, Parks, and Wang found Alice, it was hard to know that this had once been a human. But they knew one thing for certain, that this was the work of the old man, and they suspected that he wasn't close to being done with his campaign of Halloween terror. Next came a little boy named Jason and his unfortunate friends. They were dressed as the Justice League, with Jason leading the group as Batman, all of them wearing costumes that made them feel like true heroes. It had been a good night, their bags heavy with candy. As they walked down an alleyway they'd passed through countless times on their way home from school, they had no idea what was waiting for them. A long, gnarled hand dripping with black ooze suddenly shot out of the wall and grabbed the boy dressed as Superman. He screamed as he was pulled towards the ooze, his braces shining in the moonlight, and kept screaming until he disappeared into the solid brick wall. The rest of the Justice League broke into frightened screams and scattered, but they weren't fast enough. Hands kept emerging from the wall, grabbing the children, burning them, pulling them into the dark. Only Jason got away, running and screaming as his friends were yanked into the void. But no one gets away from the old man that easily. A black puddle formed on the ground in front of Jason, and the old man rose out of it, still grinning its malicious, spiteful grin. Jason fell to the ground, his legs giving out from the fear. But the old man didn't move. He just stared at him, sizing him up, deciding what type of torment would yield the most twisted pleasure. The creature lifted something up to its mouth, something that might have been mistaken for a piece of Halloween candy from a distance. But Jason knew better. It was a tooth, and Jason could recognize the shining braces still stuck to it. The old man put the tooth in his mouth and crunched it like a jawbreaker, as Jason almost passed out from the sheer terror of watching it. To this day, nobody knows why the old man spared Jason, but when Agents Drack, Parks, and Wang found the boy, the only survivor from the massacre of his friends, he was gripping the metal fragment from Billy's tooth so hard that it was embedded into his palm. But the night still wasn't over yet. The old man still wanted to have just a little bit more Halloween fun. One little boy couldn't join in on the Halloween adventures all his friends were having. He was stuck at home sick with a stomach flu that had been going around at school. All he could do was sit and watch scary movies as his mother answered the door, passing out candy to the trick-or-treaters that he wished he could join. He sighed as he heard his mom at the front door giving candy to pirates, zombies, and vampires. Tomorrow would be even worse when he was forced to watch his friends eating their candy and reminiscing about all the fun that he wasn't involved in. His self-pitying was interrupted when he heard his mother open the door to another trick-or-treater, but this time, there was no exchange of words or candy, just a long, blood-curdling scream. The little boy quickly got up to investigate, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of his mother's pain kept echoing down the hall as the heavy footsteps of something else approached. It rounded the corner and the little boy saw it in all of its horrifying glory, like something out of one of the old horror movies he had been watching, only worse. It was the rotting old man, dragging his dying mother along with one hand that was stuck right into the flesh of her chest and grabbing her by the ribcage. He screamed and ran upstairs towards the bathroom, the only room in the house with a lock. He could hear the plodding footsteps of the creature following him up the stairs, followed by the sickening sound of what must have been the old man dropping his mother's body. The little boy slammed the bathroom door shut, locked it, and collapsed against the wood. His face was hot and sticky with tears, but at least he was safe for the moment. Surely someone had heard his mother's screams and would come to save him. As he was imagining the police bursting through the front door and gunning down the monster, he heard a hissing sound coming from above him. He looked up and saw the face of the old man melting through the door and smiling at him from above. He tried to scream, but the monster opened its mouth and a tide of corrosive liquid hit him in the face. Moments later, someone did burst through the front door, but it wasn't the police. It was the 3 agents drawn to the old man's location by a trail of violence and acidic black mucus. And as far as 106 was concerned, this was a great thing. He had just finished breaking his last set of toys, and the new ones were here right on schedule. Park fired at the creature, but it wasn't enough to save Agent Drac. He was standing just a little too close and underestimated how fast the creature could move. Before he knew it, he was being dragged into a messy portal in the wall by an entity that was beyond his darkest nightmares. When he woke up, he was in the one place that anyone who knows about SCP-106 hopes never to find themselves: the Pocket Dimension, that labyrinth of twisting, rotting hallways where the old man has total dominion. You'd rather be in hell under the care of the devil himself than end up there. Agent Drac encountered horrors beyond conception before he finally, mercifully, died at the old man's hands. No weapons or training could save him. No amount of effort could dig him out of this hole. He ran through the halls for 4 whole days before SCP-106 finally got bored and started taking him apart. But to Agent Drac, those 4 days felt like a wretched eternity. When they eventually found SCP-106, he was standing in a field stomping on pumpkins out of boredom. He submitted to containment with relatively little difficulty, as Foundation field agents used high-intensity lights to subdue him. Cleanup crews applied amnestics and generated cover stories. Everything about the Halloween night massacre was swept under the rug. Back in containment, SCP-106 once again sat cross-legged on the floor of his cell, sorting a little collection of his victims' teeth like Halloween candy. He sat and smiled, mulling over the memories of his delightful Halloween night. He'd be fine for another few months now. He could just sit and enjoy the thoughts until the Foundation got bored and loosened the leash again. 106 is a patient monster. When the time came, he'd be ready. He was always ready.
The diver screams a silent scream as the giant squid's beak digs into his skin, its many grasping tentacles grabbing him and holding him in place. Nearby, his fellow divers are driven half-mad with terror as they see mysterious figures floating towards them through the murk, and strange Russian voices speaking in their heads. Nobody can help them. They're down too deep, too consumed by the darkness and the pressure of the sea. They're now at the mercy of whatever is inside the submarine. Beginning in the 1940s, with the dawn of nuclear weapons, the American government conducting the world's first atomic weapons test, and the Soviet Union responding in kind with nuclear testing of their own, the two powers entered an arms race fueled by rivalry and a thirst to prove their strength on the world stage. What followed were decades of staggering technological advancements as each nation tried to outdo and intimidate the other. The Soviet Union crossed into the cold reaches of outer space, deploying the satellite Sputnik. The United States responded with the founding of NASA. Tensions reached a fever pitch during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, as United States citizens feared they were teetering on the brink of nuclear war. In July of 1968, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States came together to sign the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, agreeing to abandon their pursuit of increasing nuclear power and turn their focus to disarmament. But several months before the treaty was signed, the Soviet government was dealing in weaponry far more dangerous than nuclear missiles, something the other world powers knew nothing about. These deadly secrets were hidden aboard a submarine known as SCP-741. SCP-741 is the underwater wreckage of a Soviet submarine that sank in March of 1968 and came into the custody of the SCP Foundation in 1999. The submarine, a version of the Charlie II class, was deployed under unusual circumstances, which attracted the attention of the United States government. In an attempt to learn more about the submarine, the US government launched Project Redacted, which attempted to recover the vessel from the ocean in the early 1970s. They managed to recover a few pieces of the vessel, though the specifics are highly classified. In the late 1990s, the US government contacted the SCP Foundation, informing them of a possible Euclid or Keter-class anomaly in the wreck. At this point, it passed into the custody and surveillance of the Foundation. The submarine is on the ocean floor, broken into 3 pieces. The hull was broken into bits during Project Redacted recovery attempt.
but was largely intact when it first sank except for 2 holes, one just in front of the sail and one just below the starboard missile tubes. Apparently, the vessel sank rapidly due to flooding after an enemy missile strike, which occurred while it was surfacing. Though all parts of the submarine are accounted for, no members of the crew have been located. Additionally, none of the emergency escape equipment on board has been used, raising further questions about what became of the crew. Wherever they went, they seem to have left something behind. Whenever divers are sent down to investigate the wreckage, they report experiencing anomalous currents and strange sea life, and hearing moans, disembodied voices, and incoherent whispering. They also report seeing blurry, faintly glowing figures. Additionally, the ocean life in the area is unnaturally aggressive, particularly large squid and sharks. This effect was first noted during a manned expedition into the waters around the wreckage, described in Incident Report 1741-A. Divers A-26 through A-30 embarked from the icebreaker Yamal into the waters below with the intention of studying the potential anomalous activity surrounding the wreckage. As the group of divers approached the submarine, they could feel the shift in the water around them, the oppressive feeling of abnormally increasing pressure bearing down and threatening to crush them. If their specialized diving equipment were to fail, they knew that that would be it, and the command would have to come and fish their corpses out of the water. Or even worse, they would vanish entirely, meeting the same mysterious fate as the crew of that doomed submarine. But they couldn't fixate on that. They had a job to do. At first glance, the wreckage appeared undisturbed, unchanged since the previous inspection. Still, they needed to take a closer look to be sure. As the team got closer to the vessel, A-30 was startled by the sight of movement from within the wreckage, spotting motion through one of the holes in the structure as something passed by. He pointed it out to his colleagues, but they dismissed it as likely a giant isopod or spider crab, which were crawling all over the surrounding area. A-30 laughed off his jumpiness, agreed that they were probably right, and continued the exploration as planned. Control authorized the divers to proceed to the next step, and A-29 activated sonar and lights, moving toward the starboard side breach. There, a faint glowing caught his eye. The glow resembled that of radioactive material, but when the team checked the radiation levels in the area, they remained stable. Whatever the source of the glow was, it wasn't radioactive. At this point, his neutron counter began to register something, and all of a sudden, a disembodied voice could be heard saying, "Vasily Yevgeny, can you hear me?" The voice was muffled, and though it could be heard over their communication channels, it emanated from somewhere in the wreckage, deep, deep underwater. As A-29 watched, a glowing shape emerged from the darkness. It was only an outline, the suggestion of a silhouette, but the shape was undeniably familiar. It looked like a person. The other divers quickly noted the apparition too and began to panic. Some checked their nitrogen levels, believing it to be some sort of nitrogen narcosis, while others pointed out that they couldn't all be suffering from nitrogen narcosis at the same time. The unknown voice continued speaking, saying, "Help me, it is getting hard to breathe." The divers debated what to do next, questioning whether what they were seeing was even real, when all at once, the humanoid figure vanished from sight. The divers attempted to shake off the startling encounter, and they resumed their duties, the investigation proceeding as normal. After a few moments of uneventful work, another interruption presented itself in the form of a 5-meter-long squid swimming around the wreckage. Its presence startled the divers at first, particularly those closest to the animal, but the others encouraged them to ignore it, citing the fact that there are no records of these squid attacking humans. So they did, continuing their work as the squid circled them with apparent curiosity. A-27 spotted an unusual shell below the wreckage, notably large and difficult to identify, and Control requested that they bring it up to the surface for further inspection by a marine biologist. The diver began attaching haul cables to the shell as the squid crept closer and closer. All of a sudden, A-26 screamed, and there was a sudden bloom of blood in the water. The squid, despite it being uncharacteristic behavior for its species, attacked the diver, biting him savagely. Prompted by cries for help from the diving team, Control began to reel A-26 back towards the surface, proceeding slowly to give him decompression time, and the squid took advantage of the slow retreat. It chased after the diver, grabbing hold of him and biting down again, tearing away at him as it gripped him in its tentacles. Still, Control continued reeling him in, hoping to free him from the squid's grasp as they yanked him to the surface. The other divers were ordered to get themselves out of there as fast as possible, an order they gladly obeyed. As they swam back to the surface, A30 saw something else moving in the depths. He couldn't make out what it was, but the sight of it gave him a sick feeling of dread deep in the pit of his stomach. The 4 divers were recovered alive, along with the shell. Examination of the shell indicated that it resembled that of the extinct orthoconic nautiloids, but it was not fossilized. It was taken for further study, given the possible implication of extinct species anomalously manifesting in the vicinity of SCP-714. Diver A26 lost a limb and was exposed to an unknown venom via bites from the attacking squid. His camera was destroyed in the process. As squid are not known to attack humans unprovoked, this behavior has been attributed to the influence of SCP-741, though the exact link between the two is yet to be determined. An anomalous pressure gradient surrounds the wreck with a radius of approximately 250 meters, starting around the center of the submarine. The pressure in this area is much greater than it should be, given the depth of the waters there. This unusually high pressure makes sonar analysis extremely difficult, as well as threatening the safety of any divers in the vicinity of the wreck. The few records that the Foundation has managed to obtain from the Russian and US governments indicate that the submarine was being used to transport some sort of secret cargo. Though the specifics of this cargo are still unknown, there is reason to believe that it differed from any type of nuclear or chemical weaponry. On a date redacted from official files, the SCPS Basisti was patrolling the area around SCP-741 when its sonar detected some unknown entity approaching SCP-741 from the south at a pace of 46 knots. The crew compared the acoustic signature of the contact with known submarines and torpedoes, but could not find a match. The Basisti attempted to reach the contact via sonobuoy drops and active sonar pings, but it did not respond. When the contact crossed into the total underwater exclusion zone, it became classified as hostile. At that point, the sonar recorded sounds of an undersea missile launch, and Basisti responded with the utmost urgency. The ship broke away from its original area and fired a Type 53 torpedo at the underwater threat. 15 seconds after the Basisti launched its torpedo, missiles of an unidentified configuration were seen breaking the water, flying at a height of 1.8 meters and a velocity of 0.92 Mach. The missiles did not emit any detectable radar, nor did they respond to any launch chaff or flares from the Basisti. Both of the missiles were engaged by Basisti's 3KN-5 Kinsul surface-to-air missiles and Kashtan point defense systems, and were destroyed at 1,800 meters and 210 meters from impact, respectively. After the missiles were neutralized, the hostile vessel could be heard engaging in evasive maneuvers. At this point, there were 4 closely spaced explosions and the sound of a submarine disintegrating. The identity of the attacker, as well as its intention toward SCP-741, have not yet been determined. The incident resulted in the Foundation research team suggesting an expansion of the acoustic sensor net, as well as additional patrol and defense assets placed in the area. Additionally, they advised an acquisition of undersea retaliatory capability. The incident was classified Incident 1741-C. The sonar recordings from the SCPS Basisti during Incident 1741-C were taken for further analysis by the research team. The in-depth review revealed anomalous acoustic signatures that did not match up with any known forms of propulsion, including magneto-hydrodynamic drive. Currently, the nature of the unidentified attacker remains a mystery, and it has not been attributed to any particular government or organization. Following the incident involving the SCPS Basisti, an American intelligence agent reached out to the Foundation, offering further insight into the secretive government programs looking into SCP-741. He agreed to sit for an interview with a Foundation researcher assigned to the project, on the condition that his identity remain protected. The SCP researcher's name is absent from the official file as well. The 2 men sat in a Foundation interview room, and the interviewer asked his informant why he chose to come forward, given the US government had simply chosen to sit on this information for 30 years. You've seen those reports. Project Redacted. Now we know that part too. How the directors didn't make the connection is beyond me. That and the stuff the Redacted pulled up, yeah, the other part you don't hear about is what some of the research team died of. And the crewmen we buried? Just uniforms. Also, the nuclear device we recovered wasn't a missile or torpedo warhead. It was a demolition charge. Does that make any sense? After all those clues, I had to come forward. Why the Directorate didn't is something I can't fully explain.
This particular statement puzzled the Foundation researcher, raising questions he hadn't anticipated. Only uniforms? Did this mean that the sub had been unmanned? The informant replied,
No, not unmanned. There were no bodies, but personal effects were everywhere, along with uniforms. There was some blood, human. Before you ask, on one of the torpedoes and a bit of skin where somebody probably crushed his hand loading the thing. Just no bodies left. When I first looked into all this, I had no clue what the hell had gone on down there, but I started putting things together.
The Foundation agent began to speculate based on the mounting evidence. Could it have been a Soviet weapons program? A deadly biological agent of some kind?
No, it wasn't that. I thought maybe it could have been, so I dialed up some of my contacts at Biopreparant. Us spies wind up owing each other favors after a while, and they denied it vehemently. Not your usual cover-up baloney either. They clearly stated that whatever the sub was carrying, it wasn't theirs. They wanted no part of it. Sounded like he was gonna puke when I mentioned redacted. Doctor, do you have any idea what it takes to make a bioweapons researcher sick? Now that wasn't what really bugged me though. What really kept me awake at night was the KGB file that fell into our hands. They mentioned a covert op by the Soviet military against an internal unnamed faction to get rid of a, quote, terrifying weapons that even the Soviet Union can't safely control. They wanted to lose it, whatever it was, or maybe fob it off onto the US. Of course, that all came to light right before the Iron Curtain fell, and given the atmosphere at the time, it was practically impossible to convince the directors that they weren't talking about nukes. And even once I did, they still didn't even think this was worthy of action. I mean, the redacted would probably have me hanged for treason if they ever find me, but it was worth the risk. And by what I can gather, sounds like Russia thinks so too, loaning you half the Pacific Fleet and all.
The interview continued after this point, but the rest of the conversation was considered irrelevant and stricken from the official file. The interview left the Foundation with more questions than answers, though they were more certain than ever that SCP-741 must be kept under strict containment procedures. Due to the object's location at the bottom of the sea, as well as the unusually elevated pressure around it, it is unlikely that many civilians will come into contact with it. However, as an extra protective measure, sonar and submersible monitoring is conducted on a periodic basis in order to verify that the wreckage has not been interfered with in any way. The Foundation contracted Russian warships, SCP Spasisty and Krasnoyarsk, has been selected for this purpose. If any unauthorized activity occurs in the area surrounding SCP-741, nuclear and conventional missiles may be deployed. Any movement of SCP-741 is grounds for an immediate nuclear strike. Whatever secrets SCP-741 holds, whatever it was transporting that was even more of an uncontrollable threat than nuclear warfare, they're better left alone down there, at the bottom of the sea. Now go check out SCP-2316, The Bodies in the Water, and SCP-054, Water Nymph for more.